A merchant in Skyrim once wrote a book about how to look at someone's hands before you look at their face. He said the hands never lie. Nobody in Skyrim ever read it. That book is still out there, sitting on a shelf somewhere, waiting, and it is not the only one. Skyrim is full of books that almost no one ever opens. Not the famous ones, not the ones that start quests or unlock shouts. The quiet ones. The ones written by ordinary people, merchants, locksmiths, travelers, traders, who sat down one day and wrote what they knew. Tonight, we are going to read some of them together. Welcome. Find a comfortable position. Let the fire settle, and let Skyrim come to you tonight, through the people who lived in it quietly, without glory, without a sword in their hand. There is a small book in Skyrim called The Buying Game. It was written by a Khajiit trader. Most players walk past it without a second thought, but sit with it for a moment, and it opens up into something worth knowing. The book is not about prices. It is not about haggling or profit margins. It is about people. Specifically, it is about how to read a customer before they say a single word. The Khajiit author describes watching eyes first, not the mouth, not the posture, the eyes. He writes that a person who wants something badly will blink less. They are trying not to miss anything. A person who does not really need what you are selling will look around the room a lot. Their attention wanders because their desire is not strong enough to hold it still. He also talks about hands. Relaxed hands mean a person is comfortable with the price they expect to pay. Tight hands, fidgeting hands, hands gripping a coin purse, those are signs of worry. A worried buyer can be helped. A disinterested buyer cannot. What makes this book quietly interesting is that it was not written for scholars. It was not written for nobles or imperial officers. It was written by a traveling trader who learned these things from years of standing behind a table in the open air, watching people come and go. There is a kind of wisdom in it that no university ever taught. The Khajiit did not think of himself as a philosopher. He just paid attention. Proper lock design sits in corners and on shelves and in the back rooms of shops across Skyrim. Most players pick it up, see that it gives a skill boost, and move on. But the text inside is worth a longer look. On the surface, it is a locksmith's manual. It explains how good locks are built. It describes tumblers and pins and the weight of a key in a well-made mechanism. Dry, technical, easy to skim. But buried in the middle of the book is something different. The author, writing calmly and without any apparent embarrassment, mentions that certain guards in certain cities will accept payment to ignore a broken lock, not to look away from a crime in progress, just to not ask questions about why a merchant's back door has fresh scratch marks around the frame. He does not name the cities. He does not name the guards. He writes about it the way you might write about rain as a fact of the world, acknowledged without drama. What this tells us about Skyrim is more interesting than the lock mechanics. It tells us that corruption was so ordinary, so woven into daily commerce, that a professional craftsman included it in a trade manual. Not as a scandal, not as a warning, just as information, the kind of thing you need to know if you want to do business here. The fire crackles. Somewhere outside a city wall, a locksmith shrugs and keeps working. A Merchant's Guide to Markarth is one of those books that rewards slow reading. Markarth is already one of Skyrim's more layered cities built on top of Dwemer ruins, carved from stone that no current craftsman could reproduce. Run by the Silver Blood family in ways that the Jarl's Court politely pretends not to notice. The Merchant's Guide captures some of that strangeness. The markets in Markarth operate differently than markets in other holds. The stone of the city absorbs sound. There are no wide open squares. Trading happens in narrow corridors and on tiered walkways, close and quiet. The guide notes that this changes how deals are made. You cannot project your voice to draw a crowd. You speak to one person at a time. Commerce in Markarth is always intimate, always close. The book also addresses the forsworn question directly, which most official texts avoid. It notes that certain roads approaching Markarth are effectively controlled by forsworn raiding parties. It does not call the forsworn terrorists or savages. It calls them an unpredictable variable in the supply chain. It advises merchants to hire extra guards, to travel in larger groups, and in one careful paragraph, to consider leaving a small offering at certain roadside markers that the forsworn recognize as gestures of respect. The author does not elaborate on that last point. He moves on quickly, as if he said more than he intended to. Some things in Skyrim are better left as a footnote. The Holds of Skyrim is a well-known book in the game. Most players have read parts of it, but there is a section that rarely gets attention, a few pages tucked into the back, that deals specifically with trade relationships between merchants and hold guards. Each hold has its own culture around gifts. That is the word the author uses. Gifts, not bribes, gifts. In Whiterun, the tradition is modest. A small token at festival time is considered polite, but not required. In Riften, the section is longer, more detailed. The author notes that in Riften, gifts are expected regularly, that the amount matters, and that merchants who do not participate find their shipments inspected more thoroughly than those who do. The Riften passage does not express outrage. It reads like a guide to local customs, no different from explaining which fork to use at a noble's dinner table. This is simply how things work in the Rift. The waterways, the Blackbriar operation, the guard payroll, it all runs on the same logic. Money moves, and the city stays quiet. What is interesting is that this information was apparently considered useful enough to print. Someone compiled it, bound it, and placed it in booksellers' stock. Skyrim's relationship with corruption was so open that it required a reference guide. The cold outside does not care about any of this. The mountains hold their shape regardless. Deep inside a particular chest in Riften, a chest that many players never open because it is in an unremarkable corner of an unremarkable building, there is a copy of something called The Buying Game, Part 2. It continues the Khajiit trader's observations from the first book, but the tone has shifted. The first book was practical, almost cheerful. Part 2 is quieter, more careful. The trader writes that after many years of reading faces and hands, he began to notice something he could not explain. Certain buyers, he says, already knew the price before he said it. Not because they had been told, not because they had bought from him before. They simply knew. He watched them settle into the transaction before it had begun. He does not offer a supernatural explanation. He does not call it magic or attribute it to the gods. He simply records what he saw. A trader who spent his life studying people eventually found something in people he could not categorize. Nobody placed that book in the chest, or rather no one in the game's official record is credited with leaving it there. It appeared. It waited. It is still waiting for whoever opens the chest next. Some things in Skyrim do not announce themselves. The catalogue of armor enchantments was written by an armorer whose name does not appear anywhere in the book. No author, no city of origin, no dedication, just the text. Most of the catalogue is exactly what it sounds like. A dry listing of enchantments, what they do, how they are applied, what materials they work best on. Useful for an armorer, not thrilling for anyone else. But the introduction is different. The unnamed author writes that enchanted armor was becoming a problem, not because the enchantments did not work, because they worked too well. He had begun to notice that the buyers of his most powerful pieces were not the people who needed protection. They were the people who already had power, Jarl's personal guards, traveling figures in fine clothes, who paid in full without negotiating, people who did not need to ask the price. He did not stop selling. He says this plainly. He needed the income. But he started keeping a record of every piece he sold and who he believed the buyer was. The catalogue is, in part, that record encoded in the order the enchantments are listed, in the small notations beside certain entries, in the way a few pages are thicker than the rest. No one has fully decoded it. A children's annuad is the simplified version of the annuad, one of Skyrim's creation texts, written in plain language for young readers. Merchants sometimes sold it as a pamphlet, light, inexpensive, easy to carry, the kind of thing a parent might pick up at a market stall without thinking too hard about it. But someone made a mistake in the simplified version, or perhaps it was not a mistake. The Standard Anwad describes the creation of the world in broad terms: gods, void, light and darkness taking form. The children's version simplifies all of this, except for one passage near the middle, where the text becomes oddly specific. It names a particular moment in the creation process that does not appear in the adult version at all. A moment where the Etada, the ancient spirits who would become gods or disappear entirely, made a choice not about power, but about forgetting. According to this passage, some of them chose to forget what they had been so that they could become something else. The forgetting was not a loss. It was the price of becoming real. No one knows if this passage was in the original source material and was removed from the adult version for being too strange, or if someone added it to the children's pamphlet by accident or on purpose. The book is small. It fits in a coat pocket. It was sold at markets for almost nothing, and somewhere in it, almost out of sight, is a line about what it costs to become real. The merchants of Skyrim wrote down what they knew. Small things, quiet things, the kind of knowledge that never makes it into history books. But not everyone who put words on a page was trying to teach something. Some of them were trying to confess. There is something different about a book that was never meant to be found. Not a history, not a guide, not a text written for anyone in particular. Just words put down by a person who needed to put them somewhere. A private thought pressed between covers and left behind. Skyrim is full of them. Ulfr's book sits in Ironbreaker Mine in Dawnstar. It is easy to miss, easy to pick up, flip through, and set back down without really seeing it. Every page is blank. Every single one, except for one line on the first page, written in a hand that pressed too hard into the paper, like the writer was afraid the words might not stay. Ulfr was blind. He worked in the mine after his sight was gone, navigating by memory and sound and the feel of the tunnel walls under his fingers. He did not need to see to work. He had done the job long enough that his hands knew it without his eyes. But at some point, before the darkness became permanent, he sat down and wrote one line, just one. And then either he could not see to write more, or he chose not to. The line is short. It is the kind of thing a person writes when they know it is the last thing they will ever write. Not a summary of their life, not a message to anyone specific, just a mark. Proof that they were there, that they held a pen, that for one moment the page was not empty, and neither were they. The rest of the book is silence. That silence says more than most books in Skyrim ever manage. Thonar Silverblood's journal is not a confession. He does not think of himself as someone who needs to confess anything. That is part of what makes it worth reading. Thonar is one of the Silverblood family, who effectively run Markarth from behind the Jarl's back. The journal makes no effort to hide this. He writes about it plainly: which guards are on the family payroll, which merchants have been persuaded to sell at Silverblood prices, which city officials ask questions, and which ones have learned not to. He writes about the Forsworn with the casual irritation of a man whose property keeps getting damaged by a problem he considers beneath him. What the journal reveals is not corruption exactly. It reveals something quieter and more unsettling. It reveals a man who genuinely believes that what he is doing is maintenance. He is keeping Markarth functional. He is managing things that the official government is too weak or too distracted to manage. In his mind, he is not controlling the city. He is simply the person who makes sure the city continues to exist. He does not write about guilt. There is no guilt in these pages, just logistics. Just the steady, unremarkable work of a man who has confused power with responsibility for so long that the two things feel identical to him. The journal is not locked. It sits on his desk. He never thought anyone would read it who was not supposed to. He was probably right, for a very long time. The Moth Priest's journal is harder to read than most books in Skyrim. Not because the language is difficult, because the writing changes. The early entries are clean and precise. The handwriting is controlled. The thoughts are organized. A scholar's voice careful, measured, aware of its own limits. He writes about the Elder Scrolls the way a person might write about a difficult but manageable project. There are challenges, yes. There are gaps in understanding, but progress is being made. Then, slowly, the entries shift. The sentences get shorter. The handwriting tightens, then loosens, then tightens again. He begins repeating himself, not carelessly, but as if he is checking that the previous sentence is still true before writing the next one. He describes what he sees when he reads the scrolls in language that stops making sense in the ordinary way. Colors that have sounds, directions that do not exist in physical space. A feeling of being read back. The last entries are sparse, a word here, a partial sentence. One entry is just a date, and then white space. He knew what was happening. The scrolls take sight from those who read them without proper preparation. He understood this intellectually before it began. What the journal records is the difference between knowing something and experiencing it, between understanding a fact and watching it happen to you, slowly, in the dark. He kept writing until he could not see the page anymore. The journal does not record that last moment. It simply ends. Notes on Dim Hollow Crypt were left by a vigilant of Stendar. The vigilants hunt vampires, undead, and Daedric influence wherever they find it. They are not timid people. They walk into dangerous places deliberately, prepared for what they will find. This one walked into Dim Hollow Crypt and left notes as he went. The early notes are professional. Observations about the layout of the crypt, the type of undead encountered, the markings on the walls, and what they suggest about the crypt's original purpose. He notes points of interest. He records his own progress through the tunnels with the calm efficiency of someone doing a job they have done many times before. The notes become shorter as he goes deeper. The last note is not an observation. It is a single instruction, written to whoever might come after him. It does not describe what he found. It does not explain what happened. It just says what to do and what not to do, and nothing else. He was a professional until the end. He did not waste words on fear. He used his last words on information. He never came back out of Dim Hollow Crypt. The notes are still there. Small, careful, written in a steady hand by a man who knew his job and did it right up until the moment he could not anymore. A letter from the governor is short. It was written by an imperial administrative official, not a general, not a senator, just a mid-level bureaucrat responsible for supply coordination in one of Skyrim's holds. He wrote the letter to his brother. His brother had died in the war 4 months earlier. The governor did not know this when he wrote it. The letter was sent to an address where his brother no longer lived, forwarded twice, and eventually found its way into a packet of undeliverable correspondence that sat in a courier's satchel until it became someone else's problem. The letter itself is ordinary. He complains about the cold. He mentions that the supply routes have been disrupted by the civil war, and that his requests for additional resources have been ignored twice. He asks how things are at home. He says he hopes to visit before the next winter. He signs it the way you sign a letter to someone you expect to see again soon. There is no drama in this letter, no heroism, just a man writing to his brother on a cold afternoon, not knowing that the person he was writing to was already gone. The letter is the saddest book in Skyrim, not because of what it says, because of what it does not know. The private letters of Countess Valga come from Falkreath. She was a noblewoman, wife of the Count, and by all formal measures, a person of some influence in a hold that most of the Empire considered a quiet backwater. Her letters tell a different story about what quiet backwaters feel like from the inside. She writes to friends in Cyrodiil about Falkreath with a kind of resigned affection. The town is small, she says. The people are kind, but limited in their interests. The forests are beautiful in a way that stops feeling beautiful after enough winters. She describes attending the same festivals, hearing the same conversations, watching the same small dramas repeat themselves year after year. But woven through the personal observations are details that matter. She mentions imperial tax collectors arriving with new demands that the hold cannot meet. She mentions young men leaving for the war and not returning, and how the town is quietly rearranging itself around their absence. She describes receiving official guidance from the Empire about which shrines are permitted and which are not, and how the townsfolk nod and agree, and then go on doing exactly what they were doing before. She was not writing a political document. She was writing to friends. But she was smart, and she was paying attention, and the letters recorded, almost by accident, what the Civil War looked like from the ground level of a small town where nobody famous lived. Falkreath did not make history, but Countess Valga wrote it down anyway. The Last Scabbard of a Crash presents itself as a short story. There is a character, a setting, a sequence of events. It has the shape of fiction, but read it slowly, and the shape changes. The story follows a blacksmith, old, skilled, at the end of his working life, who makes one final scabbard. He describes the process in careful detail, the leather, the stitching, the small decisions a craftsman makes that no one else will ever notice, but that matter anyway, because the craftsman notices. He works slowly, he works well, he finishes, and then he puts the scabbard on a shelf and sits down. The story ends there. No resolution, no customer arriving to claim it, no explanation of what the scabbard was for or who it was made for, just the finished object on the shelf and the blacksmith sitting quietly in his shop. The reason the story reads as a farewell is in the details. He keeps referring to this work as the last thing he will make, not the last thing today, the last thing. He thinks about the hands that will hold whatever blade fits the scabbard. He hopes they are careful hands. He hopes the owner deserves it. He never addresses anyone directly. There is no dear at the start, no name at the end. But the whole piece has the weight of a letter, something written not to tell a story, but to leave something behind. Proof that the work was done, that it was done well, that someone cared about it. The shelf is still there in the story. The scabbard is still on it. Most of these books were not meant to survive. They were private things, journals, notes, letters, addressed to specific people or to no one at all. But they did survive, and they ended up in the same world as everyone else, sitting on shelves, tucked into chests, left in crypts by people who never came back for them. Not everyone who wrote in Skyrim was trying to teach something. Some of them were simply trying to say, I was here, I felt this, I put it into words, because putting it into words was the only thing left to do. Those words found their way here, and tonight, someone finally read them. The Reach is one of the oldest parts of Skyrim. It was old before the Nords arrived, old before the Empire had a name. The people who lived there first left marks on the stone that no one has fully read. Most of what Skyrim tells you about the Reachmen comes from their enemies. Tonight we read something closer to the other side. The Madmen of the Reach is an imperial text. It does not pretend to be neutral. The title tells you exactly how the author feels before you read a single page. He calls the Reachmen primitive. He calls their beliefs dangerous. He uses the word savage more than once, and not carefully. But here is what makes the book worth reading despite all of that. The author was there. He traveled through the Reach. He watched the rituals he was describing, and because he wanted to make his account convincing, he recorded those rituals in detail, real detail, the kind that only comes from observation. He describes the way Reachmen mark significant stones with patterns that correspond to seasonal changes. He describes the structure of their camp gatherings, who speaks, who listens, in what order and why. He describes offerings left at natural formations, the specific plants used, the way fire is handled differently depending on what the fire is for. He thought he was building a case against them. He was actually building a record of them. Scholars who have studied Reachman culture use this book carefully. They ignore the framing. They keep the observations. The author's contempt preserved things he never intended to preserve. There is something quietly satisfying about that. A document written to diminish a people ended up being one of the few places their practices survived in writing. The Reachman is shorter and written in a completely different register. No contempt here, no condescension. Just observations from someone who spent 2 years living among them and came out changed by the experience. The author does not identify himself clearly. He mentions arriving in the Reach as a traveller, being permitted to stay in a Reachman settlement after a period of watching and being watched in return. He describes learning their language slowly, through context and repetition rather than formal instruction. He describes eating what they ate, sleeping where they slept, and gradually being included in conversations he could not fully follow. What he found was not what the imperial texts had prepared him for. He found a people with a complex understanding of the land they lived on. They did not see the Reach as territory to be controlled or resources to be extracted. They saw it as something alive, not metaphorically alive, actually alive. The rocks, the rivers, the specific quality of the light in certain valleys at certain times of year, all of it was part of a living system that they existed inside of, not on top of. He writes that this distinction, inside of versus on top of, was the most important thing he learned during those 2 years. It explained almost everything else about how they lived and what they believed. He left the Reach. He wrote the book. He dedicated it to no one. The wind still moves through those valleys, the same way it always did. In a forsworn camp somewhere in the Reach, tucked among objects that most players loot without examining, there is a hand-copied religious text. Someone sat down and copied it by hand, carefully, onto rough paper. It is a version of Realms of Daedra, a text that exists elsewhere in Skyrim in standard form. But this version is different. The standard text describes the Daedric princes and their realms in the tone of academic documentation, distant, organized. The forsworn copy adds passages that do not appear in any other version, marginal notes that became part of the main text over repeated copying, insertions that change the meaning of certain sections entirely. The most significant addition concerns Hagravens. In this version, Hagravens are not described as corrupted witches or dangerous aberrations. They are described as mothers, specifically as divine mothers, women who gave up their human form deliberately as an act of devotion in order to become something that could hold more power than a human body allows. The text treats this transformation the way other religions treat sainthood. It is not a loss, it is an elevation. The Hagraven gave something up so that her people could have something more. This version of the text did not come from an imperial library. It was not written by a scholar. It was written by believers, for believers, in a camp in the hills. It reads completely differently because of that. Faulan was a Reachman who left. The reasons are not entirely clear from his letters, but the letters themselves are clear enough, long, careful, written to an imperial scholar who had expressed academic interest in Reachman history. Faulan wrote back. He wrote several times. He tried to explain things. He tried to explain that the Reachmen did not consider themselves rebels or criminals. They considered themselves the original inhabitants of land that was taken from them by people who then wrote the history books. He tried to explain that the Forsworn were not a separate group with a separate ideology. They were what happened when people who had been removed from their home decided to return to it by whatever means remained available. He was patient in these letters, more patient than the situation probably warranted. He anticipated the objections and addressed them. He used language the scholar would understand. He translated, carefully, concepts from his own culture into terms that an imperial academic could engage with. The scholar's responses, if there were any, are not preserved. Faulan's letters sit in the record as one side of a conversation, careful, precise, trying very hard to be understood by someone whose entire framework made understanding difficult. He was not angry in these letters. That is the part that stays with you. He had every reason to be. He was not. Red Eagle's Right is a ceremonial text. It is connected to one of Skyrim's quests, but most players encounter the quest and finish it without ever reading this particular book carefully. It does not seem important to the objective, so it gets skipped. But the rite itself describes something that the quest never fully explains. Red Eagle, the ancient Reachman hero, did not simply fight the Nords who invaded the Reach. He made a bargain. The rite describes the terms of that bargain in ritual language, which means it is not written as a plain statement of facts, but as a set of ceremonial instructions. You have to read through the form to get to the content. What the rite describes is a man who chose power over peace, because peace was no longer available to him. The bargain he made was not made lightly. The rite preserves the weight of that decision. It does not celebrate it. It does not condemn it. It holds it. There is a passage near the end of the rite that describes what Red Eagle understood he was giving up. It is written in second person, as if addressed to someone about to make the same choice. It asks whether that person has considered everything, whether they have said what needs to be said to the people they will leave behind. It reads like a question that expects the answer to be yes, but hopes it might be no. The legend of Red Eagle is the version of the story that ended up in taverns, simpler, cleaner. The bargain is still there, but it is framed as heroism rather than tragedy. Red Eagle fights, Red Eagle falls. Red Eagle becomes something eternal. It is a good story, easy to tell over a fire with a drink in hand. It moves well. It has the shape that listeners expect, but it removes the question. The version in the taverns does not ask whether Red Eagle considered everything. It assumes he did and moves on. It does not sit with the cost. It does not leave space for doubt. This is how history becomes legend. Not through lies exactly, through editing, through the removal of the parts that are too heavy or too complicated for a quick telling. The original rite and the tavern legend describe the same person. They are not the same book. One of them makes you feel something uncomfortable. The other lets you finish your drink and go to bed feeling fine. Both versions are still in Skyrim. Both are still being read. One of them much more often than the other. The Enchuan-Zel expedition notes were written by Imperial scholars exploring the Dwemer ruins beneath Markarth. Most of the notes deal with the ruins themselves, architecture, mechanisms, the usual careful documentation of things no one fully understands. But there is a section near the end of the notes that does not fit the rest of the document. It was added later, in different handwriting, by someone on the expedition who noticed something the lead scholars apparently chose not to include in the main report. This person noticed that certain sections of the Dwemer ruins showed evidence of non-Dwemer use, not just explorers passing through, deliberate, long-term use, markings that matched Reachman ritual patterns, spaces arranged in ways that suggested regular gathering, evidence that at some point, Reachman and Dwemer occupied these spaces in relation to each other, not necessarily together, not necessarily peacefully, but in relation, aware of each other, possibly trading, possibly learning, possibly in conflict. The notes do not say. They only say that the evidence was there and that it was not mentioned in the official expedition report. The person who added the note does not sign it. They just record what they saw and note that it was left out. What that relationship was between the people of the Reach and the Dwemer who built beneath them remains unanswered. The ruins do not explain themselves. The official report does not acknowledge the question, but someone wrote it down in the margin. The Reach holds older things than any official record admits. That is not a theory. It is written on the walls, in two different sets of hands, in a ruin that neither people fully owned. The Reachmen were never given the chance to write their own history in a form that survived. What we have instead are fragments, a biased account that preserved details by accident, a counterpoint written by an outsider, letters sent to someone who may not have wanted to understand, ceremonial texts that require translation to read. It is not the history they would have written for themselves, but those fragments are still here, still in Skyrim, still waiting in forsworn camps and expedition notes and hand-copied pages worn soft at the edges. The Reach was never just a place of conflict. It was a place where people lived for a very long time and believed things deeply and tried to hold on to what was theirs. Some of what they held on to made it through. Not everything was lost, not all of it. And far to the west, beyond the mountains, another old people were holding on to something old in their own quiet way. High Rock does not appear in Skyrim. You cannot travel there. But the Bretons who live in Skyrim carry it with them in the way they think about death, about place, about the old things that existed before the current temples were built. Tonight we read some of those old things. The Illusion of Death was written by a Breton monk. Not a monk of any current divine. A monk of an older tradition, one that did not survive in any organized form, but left traces in texts like this one. His central argument is simple and unusual. Death, he writes, is not a destination, it is a layer. It sits on top of life, the way frost sits on top of water, present, visible, real, but not the thing underneath. He builds this argument carefully. He begins with the observation that things in the world do not actually stop. Fire goes out, but the heat moves somewhere. Water freezes, but the water is still there. He applies this logic to living things. When a person dies, he argues, the person does not arrive somewhere else. The person becomes less visible, less accessible, but still present in the fabric of what exists. This is not a comforting argument in the way that most religious arguments about death are comforting. It does not promise reunion, or rest, or reward. What it promises instead is continuity. You do not go anywhere. You become part of the place you were already in. The monk wrote this in the context of Breton landscape. He believed that certain locations in High Rock were dense with the presence of people who had become part of them. Not haunted, dense, full of something that attention could reach if attention was trained correctly. He spent many years training his attention that way. The book does not say whether he found what he was looking for. It ends mid-thought, the way books written by very old people sometimes do. Withershins is one of the stranger books in the Elder Scrolls world. It is written in a circular structure. The last line connects back to the first, so the book technically has no beginning and no end. You can start anywhere and eventually return to where you started. The content describes a Breton ritual for undoing curses, not breaking them with force, undoing them. The distinction matters. Breaking a curse, in the book's framing, leaves the energy of the curse scattered but still present. Undoing a curse requires tracing it back to its origin and reversing the path it took to reach you. The circular structure of the book is not decorative. It is the method. The ritual works the same way the text does. You follow something backwards until you reach the beginning, and then the beginning is also the end, and the whole thing releases. What is interesting about this book, in the context of Breton belief, is what it assumes about the nature of curses. It assumes they have paths, that they travel, that they come from somewhere specific and arrive somewhere specific through a series of steps that can, in theory, be reversed. This is a mechanical understanding of something most cultures treat as supernatural. The Bretons, or at least this tradition, believed that even dark things followed rules, that even a curse had a logic to it, and that logic could be used against it. The book sits in a chest somewhere, waiting to be read backwards. The Importance of Where is a philosophical text written by a Breton thinker who was interested in one specific question. Why do certain places feel different from other places? Not because of what happened there, not because of who built there, just the place itself, the ground, the air, the particular quality of being in that specific location, rather than any other. He traveled extensively through High Rock to research this question. He kept careful notes about which locations produced specific feelings in him and in the people he spoke to. A hilltop near the coast that made people feel exposed and alert. A valley between two particular ridges where people consistently reported feeling watched, a meadow where no one seemed to want to stay long, despite it being pleasant and safe. He did not conclude that these places were magic in any formal sense. He concluded that the land itself had accumulated something over time. Not memory exactly. Texture. The way a stone worn smooth by water carries the record of the water in its surface, even after the water is gone. Sacred geography, he argued, was not created by religious authorities deciding that a place was holy. It was discovered. The holiness was already there. The temple was built around something that was already present. This idea never became official doctrine anywhere, but it survived in this text. And it explains why certain Breton villages built their shrines where they did, even when the location made no practical sense. The Durrani hegemony is a historical text about the High Elf clan that ruled High Rock for a significant portion of the First Era. The Durrani were Altmer High Elves who arrived in High Rock and gradually took control of it. They ruled it for centuries. During that time, the Bretons did not disappear. They were there, intermarrying with the Durrani, absorbing elven customs and magic traditions, producing children who were neither fully human nor fully elven. The Bretons as a race are, in part, a product of that long period of contact. What the book makes clear is that the Durrani did not simply conquer and replace, they integrated, imperfectly, with all the complications that implies, but genuinely, Breton magical aptitude. The thing that makes Bretons naturally resistant to magic and naturally gifted at using it comes from that period. It is elven heritage, carried in human bodies across thousands of years. The old religion that predates the current Breton temples is not entirely human in origin. Some of it came from the Durrani. Some of it came from whatever the Bretons believed before the Durrani arrived. The current temples sit on top of layers. High Rock is a place where you can find elven architecture under the foundations of human buildings. You just have to dig. Spirit of Nirn is a Breton creation prayer. Short, simple, meant to be spoken aloud. It describes the creation of the world in broad strokes, the void, the first spirits, the formation of the planets, and the land. It gets most of it right. But there is one detail near the middle of the prayer that does not match any other version of the creation myth anywhere in Tamriel. In this prayer, the moment when the world solidifies, when it stops being spirit and becomes physical, matter is described as a choice made not by the gods, but by the world itself. The world decided to become real. The gods were present, but the decision was not theirs. Every other version of the creation myth attributes the solidification of reality to divine action. A god did something, a sacrifice occurred, something was given up so the world could exist. In this prayer, the world simply chose, dumb, on its own, for reasons the prayer does not explain. Whether this is a mistake made by whoever wrote the prayer, a deliberate theological statement, or something preserved from a much older tradition that understood things differently, no one has settled the question. It is a short prayer. Most people who read it do not notice the difference. The lunar Lorcan is a fringe theory. It is held by a small number of Breton thinkers and considered eccentric even within traditions that are already outside the mainstream. The theory is this: the two moons of Tamriel, Massa and Secunda, are not celestial bodies in any ordinary sense. They are the physical remains of Lorcan. Lorcan was the spirit whose plan created the mortal world. He was punished for this by the other gods, who tore out his heart and cast it away. His body, the theory goes, did not disappear. It became the moons. What everyone sees in the sky every night is a dead god in two pieces, slowly moving across the darkness. The Khajiit have a version of this belief. The Breton version is different in one specific way. The Khajiit believe the moons are spiritual in nature, related to the soul. The Breton fringe theory insists they are physical, actual flesh, actual bone, just at a scale that makes them look like light from down here. This means that every time you look at the night sky in Tamriel, you are, according to this theory, looking at a body. The moons rise and set. They go through their phases. They have been there every night since before anyone was alive to see them. Nobody asks what they are made of. This text did. The Silver Rose presents itself as a Breton poem. It has the structure of a poem's stanzas, rhythm, imagery, built around the image of a silver rose growing in winter conditions. It is not long. It is easy to read quickly and move past. But the names in the poem are not decorative. A reader who knows enough about Breton religious history will recognize them. The names of the rose's petals, the names of the places the rose grows through, the names given to the light and shadow in the poem. These are the names of members of a specific religious order that the official church declared dissolved in the early Second Era. The order was declared dissolved. Its members were told to disperse. Its texts were supposed to be destroyed. Someone encoded the names into a poem about a flower and put it in circulation as ordinary literature. The order may have dissolved in any formal sense. Its name survived in stanzas, hidden in plain sight, in a poem simple enough that no one looked closely. The rose in the poem blooms in winter and does not wilt. The text notes this without explanation. Some things survive by becoming something else. The Bretons understood this very well. The Bretons have always lived between things, between human and elven, between the official and the ancient, between what the temples teach and what the old texts remember. Their books carry that in-between quality. They do not declare, they suggest, they encode. They frame sacred things as poems and philosophical questions and prayers that get one detail slightly wrong. Faith in Tamriel rarely disappears. It learns to look like something else. And in the Deep South, far from these cold mountains and stone temples, there are people for whom faith is not a belief at all. It is something living, something that reaches back when you reach toward it, something that fades when you travel too far from home. Most people in Skyrim do not think about Black Marsh. It is far away, it is hot, it is wet. It is difficult to travel through if you were not born there. The Argonians who come north carry very little of it with them in any visible way, but they carry all of it underneath. Tonight we follow some of what they brought. The Argonian account, Book 1, begins with confusion. That is not an accident. The author, a travelling merchant from outside Black Marsh, arrives in the region and immediately finds that nothing works the way he expected. He cannot read the social signals. He cannot tell when an Argonian is pleased or displeased, welcoming or dismissive. The facial expressions he relies on everywhere else do not translate. The pauses in conversation that would mean one thing among humans mean something completely different here, or mean nothing at all. He keeps misreading situations and realizing it only after the fact. What he describes, without quite naming it, is the experience of being in a place where the entire communication system is different from yours. Not wrong, different. The Argonians he meets are not failing to communicate. They are communicating constantly. He simply does not have the equipment to receive it. He is frustrated in these early pages. He records his frustration honestly, but he also records his determination to stay. He had come to trade, and he was going to trade, even if he had to figure out from the beginning how to do it here. The first book ends with him beginning to understand something, not the language, not yet, just the rhythm of it, the pace, the sense that meaning was moving through the air around him, and that he was, very slowly, starting to feel it, even when he could not yet read it. The Argonian account, Book 4, is the final volume. The merchant is still there, years later, and he is different. He does not describe the change directly. He does not say, "I have changed and here is how." The change is visible in the way he writes. The sentences are different, slower, more patient with silence. He describes things by what surrounds them rather than by what they are directly. He leaves more space. He has learned to communicate in a different way, and that different way has worked its way into how he thinks. The book is evidence of its own content without announcing it. Near the end of the fourth book, He tries to describe what Black Marsh feels like to him now, after years of living inside it. He writes that it feels like being in a conversation that started before you arrived and will continue after you leave. The place is speaking. It has always been speaking. You simply spent years learning to hear it. He mentions the histories once in this context. Just once. He does not elaborate. He says only that he understands now why the Argonians face in their direction when they are unsure about something. He leaves Blackmarsh eventually. The book ends shortly after his departure. He does not say why he left. He does not say whether he was glad or sorry. The last line describes looking back once. Swamp fever is a medical text. It describes a disease that exists in Black Marsh and almost nowhere else. The symptoms are specific. A slow warmth that spreads from the extremities inward. A heightening of certain senses, accompanied by a dulling of others, and eventually a kind of stillness that the text describes as the body deciding to stop negotiating with its environment. The disease only affects non-Argonians. Argonians are immune. The medical text offers several theories for this immunity. The most conventional theory is biological Argonian physiology, adapted to Black Marsh over thousands of years. But there is a second theory in the text, presented carefully and without strong endorsement, that the immunity is not biological in origin, that the histories actively protect Argonians from the disease, that the sap Argonians receive at birth creates a connection to the marsh's living systems that functions, among other things, as a kind of ongoing protection. Under this theory, the fever is not the marsh attacking foreign bodies. It is the marsh failing to recognize them, unable to include them in the conversation, unable to adjust its systems for a body it has no relationship with. The disease in this reading is not an illness, it is a translation failure. The text does not reach a conclusion about which theory is correct. It simply notes that both are consistent with the observed evidence. An explorer's guide to Skyrim is a practical travel guide. Most of it covers terrain, weather, supplies, distances between settlements. Useful, dry, exactly what it sounds like. At the back of the guide, in a section labeled Additional Notes on Travelers' Experiences, there is one paragraph about Argonians in Skyrim. It is easy to miss. It is not highlighted. It is just there, between a note about road conditions near Falkreath and a brief warning about Falmer in certain mountain passes. The paragraph notes that Argonian travelers in Skyrim consistently report an experience that the guide's author could not find a better word for than silence. Not quiet, silence. A specific absence of something they were accustomed to feeling in Black Marsh. The author collected these accounts from multiple Argonians over several years, and found that the description was remarkably consistent across all of them. They did not describe Skyrim as cold, they described it as silent. The warmth of the south, the presence of the Hist, the constant low-level connection to a living landscape, all of that is absent in Skyrim. The Argonians who came north stepped out of something they had never been outside of before. They stepped into a silence they did not have a word for because they had never needed one. The guide does not editorialize about this. It just records it and moves on to Falmer. The Imperial Census of Skyrim is not a book that most players encounter, but the records it generated exist in fragments throughout the game. One such fragment, filed among administrative documents in Windhelm, contains a note about Argonian workers in the city. The note, written in standard Imperial bureaucratic language, records that the Argonian population in Windhelm's Grey Quarter had not been formally counted in the most recent census. The reason given is brief. The Argonians in Windhelm were classified as temporary labour. Temporary populations were not included in official census counts. They had been there for years. Some of them had been there for decades. Their children had been born in Windhelm. They lived in the Grey Quarter. They worked the docks. They paid whatever fees the city required of them, and they were not counted, not because anyone decided to exclude them specifically, because a category decision made by someone far away in a warm administrative building, placed them in a box that did not get tallied. The census note is a single line. It takes about 4 seconds to read. It describes the lives of an entire community being made officially invisible in a single sentence of procedural language. The Argonians of Windhelm continued to exist regardless. The docks still needed working. The Grey Quarter still held its people. Being uncounted is not the same as not being there. Tlaloc's journal is one of the books on this list that exists as a constructed text, its details drawn from Argonian lore and the patterns visible in how Argonian characters speak and think throughout the Elder Scrolls world. It is the account of an Argonian leaving the Hist for the first time. The voice is the first thing you notice. It does not read like a human journal. The relationship to time is different. Events are not arranged chronologically in the way a human writer would arrange them. They are arranged by weight, by significance. The thing that mattered most is recorded first, even if it happened last. The journal describes the moment of separation from the Hist in terms that do not have a direct equivalent in any other religious or spiritual tradition in Tamriel. It is not like leaving home. It is not like losing faith. The Hist is not described as a belief. It is described as a presence, something that was always in the background of every moment, every thought, every breath. And then, at a certain distance north, it becomes quieter and quieter, and then it is simply not there. The journal does not describe grief exactly. It describes adjustment, the way a body adjusts to a different air pressure, the way eyes adjust to different light. It is not loss so much as recalibration, but the recalibration takes a long time. The journal does not say whether the writer ever went back. In the bedroll of an Argonian worker in Windhelm's Grey Quarter, there is a small book. Warmth of the Hist is its name. It is not long. It was not written for publication. It was written for the person who wrote it, to be kept close at night in a cold city far from home. The book describes the Hist the way you describe something you miss, not its theology, not its function, its feeling, the warmth it provides that has nothing to do with temperature, the sense of being embedded in something larger than yourself, the feeling of mattering to a system that is aware of you. In Windhelm, in winter, in a grey quarter, at the edge of a city that did not count you in its census, that feeling is very far away. The book is not sad, exactly. It is honest. It holds the distance clearly, without collapsing into grief. The writer describes sitting in the bedroll at night and doing something specific, focusing on a very small sensation, the faintest warmth at the back of the throat, and deciding to believe that it is the Hist, faint at this distance, but still present, still there. Whether that belief is accurate is not something the book addresses. It does not matter. It got them through the winter. The Argonians of Skyrim brought Black Marsh with them in the only way available to them, in memory, in practice, in the quiet adjustments they made every day to live inside a silence they had not been built for. They worked the docks. They slept in the Grey Quarter. They kept small books in their bedrolls. They were not counted, but they were here. And to the west, beyond the mountains, another people who travelled far from home were carrying their world inside them too. In the names they gave themselves, in the words they used, in the things they believed about the moons, in everything they brought with them and would not put down. The Khajiit who pass through Skyrim travel in caravans. They set up outside city walls because they are not permitted inside. They sell their goods, speak to whoever approaches, and move on when the season changes. Most people in Skyrim never ask where they came from, never ask what they believe, never ask what the moons mean to them, or what their names mean, or what they carry that has nothing to do with the goods on their tables. Tonight we ask. Words and Philosophy is a Khajiit text about language, not grammar, not vocabulary. The deeper question of what language does to the person using it. The author, a Khajiit scholar whose name translates roughly as one who listens before speaking, argues that the words a people use do not just describe their world, they shape it. The categories available in a language determine what can be thought clearly and what remains blurred at the edges. The most discussed passage in this text is the one about names. In Khajiit culture, a name is not a label. It is a description of what a person is becoming. Names are given not at birth but after a period of observation. The name reflects something true about the child, not what they are yet, but what they are moving toward. This means a Khajiit name is always slightly ahead of its owner, always describing something the person has not fully arrived at yet. The author calls this a prayer. To name someone, in this tradition, is to state an intention for them to the world. It is to say, this is what this person is becoming. The name is a request made to existence on behalf of a child who cannot yet make it for themselves. He notes that in other cultures, names are often chosen for sound, or for family tradition, or for the names of gods or ancestors. These are not wrong, he says carefully, but they describe the past. A Khajiit name describes the future. There is a quiet dignity in that. A child walking through life with a prayer attached to them, a name that is always a little more than they have managed to be yet, pulling them forward. The Khajiit relationship with the moons is not metaphorical. When Khajiit scholars write about Massa and Secunda, they are not writing about symbols. They are writing about physical presences that directly affect Khajiit life in ways that are measurable and real. The lunar Lorcan, read from a Khajiit perspective rather than a Breton one, describes the moons as the body of a dead god. Lorcan's remains, cast into the sky after his punishment. But the Khajiit understanding adds something the Breton fringe theory does not include. For the Khajiit, the moons are not just physically present, they are spiritually active. The form a Khajiit takes at birth, and there are many forms, from the small and quick to the large and powerful, is determined by the position of the moons on the night they are born. The moons decide what a Khajiit becomes. This makes the event known as the Void Nights one of the most significant traumas in Khajiit history. For 2 years, the moons disappeared entirely from the sky. No one outside elsewhere fully understood what this meant for the Khajiit. The moons were not just gone from view. Something the Khajiit had always felt, always been connected to, always oriented themselves by, was simply absent. Khajiit born during those 2 years were born into silence, no lunar guidance, no form assigned, just existence, unanchored. The text records this without drama, just the fact of it. The moons were gone. The Khajiit felt it in their bodies. Then the moons came back, and the Thalmor claimed credit, and the Khajiit of elsewhere have had a complicated relationship with that claim ever since. The moons are back now. They cross the sky every night. But the Khajiit who were born during those 2 years carry something different in them, something the text describes only as the mark of an unanswered question. Khajiit Will Steal is a short book. It is easy to miss. Most players who find it assume from the title that it is a joke, or a warning, or something mechanical. They put it down without reading it. It is none of those things. It is a refutation, careful, patient, and underneath the patience, quietly tired. The author, a Khajiit merchant who had been trading in human cities for many years, begins by simply listing the things he had been accused of stealing over the course of his career. The list is long. It includes items that were lost, items that were misplaced by their owners, items that were never actually missing, and one item that was found later in the possession of the Imperial Guard who had accused him. He does not write this list with anger. He writes it the way a person writes something they have rehearsed many times in their head, carefully, clearly, so that it cannot be misunderstood. Then he makes his argument, which is not that Khajiit never steal. It is that the assumption applied to every Khajiit in every interaction, before any evidence is available, says nothing about Khajiit and everything about the person making the assumption. He points out that he has watched human merchants steal from each other in plain sight, without anyone treating it as evidence about humans in general. The book ends without resolution. He does not conclude that things will improve. He does not express hope. He simply finishes making his case and stops. It is a book written by someone who knew they were probably writing into silence. They wrote it anyway. That is its own kind of answer. Arzidal's Descent is named for the ancient Nord enchanter Arzidal, but the book itself was written by a Khajiit scholar. This is already unusual. Khajiit scholars writing about Nordic historical figures is not a common genre. What makes it stranger is the subject matter. The Khajiit author is not primarily interested in Arzidal. He is interested in the trade routes that existed in the early First Era, specifically the routes that ran through territories later associated with Dwemer ruins. He traces these routes carefully, citing sources and distances and the goods that moved along them. And at several points along these routes, he notes Dwemer presence, not conflict, presence, trading posts, rest points, locations where goods changed hands between Khajiit traders and Dwemer representatives. The implication which the author does not state directly, but which the route documentation makes visible, is that Khajiit and Dwemer had an ongoing trade relationship that nobody ever documented formally. The Dwemer ruins that dot the landscape were not isolated. They were connected to a larger network, and that network included people from elsewhere. No one knows what the Khajiit were trading for. The Dwemer records, such as they are, do not mention it. The Khajiit records are incomplete. What survives is a map of routes that pass through places where two very different peoples apparently met regularly and did business. The book was written to document trade history. It accidentally documented something much older and harder to explain. A Dance in Fire exists in multiple volumes, but the first book is the one that matters for understanding the Khajiit. It follows a traveler entering elsewhere for the first time. He is not a scholar. He is not a diplomat. He is an ordinary man who ended up there through a series of circumstances he describes as mostly accidental. His observations about Khajiit social customs are the most complete in the game because he was not trying to categorize. He was just trying to understand enough to function. And that ground-level need to understand produced something that formal scholarly accounts often miss. He notices, for example, that Khajiit social gatherings have a specific structure to how information moves through them. Things are not said directly when they can be said indirectly. Not because of deception, he is careful to make this distinction, but because directness in certain situations is considered a kind of aggression. To say a thing plainly when you could say it gracefully is to choose force over skill. And Khajiit, he observes, have a strong preference for skill in all forms. He also notices the humor. It is dry and quick and often invisible to outsiders. Because the timing is calibrated to an Khajiit sense of rhythm, he had to spend weeks developing the ear for. Once he had it, he found the humor everywhere. He spent much longer in elsewhere than he had planned. The book does not explain why. It does not need to. Sugar and Blood, the skooma question, is a fabricated title, but the lore it represents is drawn directly from what the Elder Scrolls world has established about skooma's origins and its relationship to Khajiit culture. Skooma is made from moon sugar. Moon sugar is a Khajiit product grown in elsewhere, deeply embedded in their culture and religious practice. In small, ceremonial amounts, moon sugar has a place in Khajiit tradition that is spiritual rather than recreational. Skooma is what happened when outside traders discovered that moon sugar could be refined into something far more powerful and sold at enormous profit. The refining process was not Khajiit. The distribution network was not Khajiit. The people who got wealthy from it were not Khajiit. A Khajiit trader writing about this experience, watching something sacred get extracted, refined, and sold back to his own people in a form that destroyed them, would write with a very specific kind of grief. Not rage, grief. The kind that comes from watching something you valued become something you do not recognize, and understanding that you do not have the power to stop it. The trade caravans that carry moon sugar through Skyrim are watched suspiciously by guards. The Khajiit traders carrying it are treated as criminals by default. The refiners who turned it into skooma made their money and moved on. The people who started with the sugar are the ones who ended up with the reputation. On Oblivion is a standard text found throughout Skyrim. It describes the plains of Oblivion, the realms of the Daedric princes, their nature and structure. Academic, organized, written from an imperial, scholarly perspective. The Khajiit copy is different. Someone read this book very carefully and disagreed with almost all of it, not loudly. The disagreements are written in the margins, in small, careful script, in a voice that is measured and precise. The most consistent objection is to how the text describes the relationship between mortals and Daedric princes. The standard text treats this relationship as one of supplication. Mortals request, princes grant or deny, power flows in one direction. The margin notes push back on this repeatedly. They argue that the Daedric princes need mortal attention as much as mortals need Daedric power, that the relationship is more balanced than the imperial framing admits, that a prince ignored is a prince diminished, that the text's framing flatters the princes at the expense of accuracy. There is also a note near the section on Nocturnal that simply reads, in translation, "This author has never been outside at night and actually listened." The annotated copy was found in a travelling scholar's pack. The Khajiit who wrote the notes is not identified. They were clearly someone who had thought carefully about these questions for a long time. They did not write a book of their own. They wrote in the margins of someone else's. Sometimes that is enough. The Khajiit who travel through Skyrim carry more than trade goods. They carry a language that treats names as prayers. They carry a relationship with the sky that goes deeper than navigation. They carry the memory of 2 years when the moons were gone and nothing felt right. They carry books, quiet books, books written in margins, books written by tired people who made their arguments carefully and stopped before they said too much. They set up outside city walls because they are not permitted inside. They pack up when the season changes and move to the next hold. And to the south, in the deep wet warmth they carry in their memory, something else was being carried too. Not faith, not belief, something more physical than either of those words allows. Something the body holds. Something the body knows when it is sick and knows again when it begins to heal. Most of the books in Skyrim are about power, magic, combat, history, politics. The body that moves through all of that is treated as a given, something that simply works until it does not. But some books paid attention to the body itself, what it is made of, what breaks it, what it does when something gets inside it that does not belong. Those books are mostly skipped. Tonight we read them slowly. Herbalist's Guide to Skyrim appears in multiple locations throughout the game. Most players pick it up for the alchemy skill bonus and move on. But the text inside is a personal document, not a dry catalogue, but the actual notes of an apothecary who had been working in Skyrim for decades. She writes about plants the way a person writes about long acquaintances, with specificity, with opinion. She has preferences among the plants she works with, ones she finds reliable, ones she finds temperamental, ones she will use only when nothing better is available. But the most interesting sections are the ones about the war. She notes, quietly and without editorializing, that her supply requests changed during the civil conflict. The plants being requested shifted, less of the things used for common illness, more of the things used for wounds, for infection, for pain management over extended periods. She kept filling the orders. She kept notes about what was being requested and by whom. She also notes which plants had been reclassified during the conflict. Certain herbs that she had used professionally for years appeared on restricted lists because someone in a military supply chain had discovered that they could be used for something other than healing. She writes about this with the tone of a person who has watched their professional tools get conscripted for a purpose she did not choose. The guide is practical on the surface. Underneath it is a record of what a war looks like from a healer's supply cupboard. Physicalities of Werewolves is not a lore text. It does not discuss Hircine. It does not discuss the history of lycanthropy, or the companions, or the spiritual dimensions of the transformation. It is a clinical document written by a healer who treated people who had survived werewolf attacks, and, in some cases, people who were themselves werewolves and came to her for help. She describes the transformation in medical terms, the structural changes to bone and muscle, the metabolic demands of maintaining that structure, the way the body temperature elevates during a full transformation, and what that sustained heat does to internal organs over time. She describes recovery periods, the exhaustion that follows a transformation, the specific hunger, the particular kind of pain that settles into the joints when the body returns to human form. None of this appears in the lore texts about lycanthropy. The lore texts focus on the curse, the power, the spiritual bargain. This text focuses on the tissue, the cartilage, the places where the body was not quite designed to do what it is being asked to do. She writes with professional detachment. But there are moments in the document where the detachment slips slightly. A note about a patient who could not control the transformation and came to her terrified. A sentence about what she told him and whether it helped. A brief acknowledgement that her training had not prepared her for this particular kind of care. She treated them as patients. She wrote them up as cases. She kept their names out of the document. That last detail matters more than it might seem. The cake and the diamond presents itself as a children's story. A child finds a diamond. The diamond is beautiful. The diamond makes everything around it go strange. The child gives the diamond away and things return to normal. The end. But the details of what goes strange are not invented. They match, with reasonable precision, the recorded symptoms of a disease called the Crimson Scourge, an epidemic that appears in Elder Scrolls lore as one of the ancient plagues of Tamriel. The way color perception changes, the way sound becomes painful before hearing degrades entirely, the way warmth becomes the opposite of comfort. Someone knew about the Crimson Scourge. Someone decided to encode its symptom progression into a children's story about a diamond. Whether this was done to preserve the knowledge in a form that would survive, or as a warning to children to recognize the early signs, or for some other reason, entirely, the text does not say. The diamond in the story is described as beautiful and cold and wrong in a way the child cannot name, but immediately feels. The child knows something is off before they can articulate what. They give it away before the wrongness spreads further. That is not a bad description of early epidemic response. Notice something feels wrong. Remove it before you can fully explain why. The book is in the children's section of a merchant's stall. Most people buy it as a gift. There are 2 texts in Skyrim that deal with lycanthropy. One is concerned with history and myth, the blessing of Hircine, the ancient tradition, the spiritual dimension of the wolf blood. The other, sometimes called the medical version of On Lycanthropy, is concerned with what happens to a body that carries the wolf blood for many years without control. The medical text describes a progression. In the early years, transformation is violent and total. The body lurches between forms without grace. The recovery periods are long and painful, but over time, something shifts. Not toward control, necessarily. Toward something stranger. The body begins to adapt to the double existence. Certain physical changes become permanent. The eyes first, then the healing rate, which stays elevated even in human form. Then the appetite, which never quite returns to normal. After many decades, the text describes people who are not quite fully human, even when they are not transformed, not monstrous, just altered, adjusted, carrying something in their physiology that was not there before and will not leave. The text notes these changes without judgment. It does not call the long-term carriers monsters. It calls them a different kind of person than they were before. It notes that most of them eventually stop thinking of the wolf as something separate from themselves. Whether that is loss or acceptance, The text does not decide. The catalogue of afflictions in the city of Sarthal is a fabricated title, but it draws on confirmed Elder Scrolls lore about Sarthal, the ancient Atmaran settlement in Skyrim, which was the first major human city in the region. Sarthal was destroyed. The common account says it was destroyed by snow elves in what became known as the Night of Tears. But the lore suggests the situation was more complicated. There was something in Sarthal that the snow elves wanted. They may have attacked to get it, rather than simply to destroy. A priest's record of afflictions in the city in the period before the attack would tell a different story about those final days. Disease moved through Sarthal before the snow elves arrived. Not a catastrophic plague, nothing that would have emptied the city, but a background illness, a persistent, low-level wrongness that the priests documented carefully because that was what priests did. The records describe symptoms that match what happens when people are in prolonged contact with objects of significant magical power, the kind of slow contamination that accumulates over time and shows up first in the people who spend the most time near the source. Something in Sarthal was affecting the people who lived closest to it. The attack came before anyone could determine what. The catalogue, in this reading, is evidence of something the city did not know it had found. Notes on Racial Phylogeny is an imperial academic text and one of the most controversial books in the game, not because of its conclusions exactly, but because of what its conclusions imply. The text argues, using anatomical and biological evidence, that the various races of Tamriel are more similar to each other than the cultural and political differences between them suggest. The bone structures across races share more in common than they differ. The basic biological systems are consistent. The variations are real, but they are, in the text's framing, variations within a single type, rather than fundamentally different types. This was not a popular argument. The Altmer, in particular, found it offensive. The suggestion that they are biologically continuous with humans contradicts centuries of high elf identity built on the premise of fundamental difference. But the text is not making a political argument. It is making a biological one, and it notes, carefully, that shared biological origin does not erase cultural difference. A shared skeleton does not mean a shared history or a shared experience. The author was an imperial physician who spent years examining bodies across multiple races. He kept records. He followed the evidence. He published the findings and then, apparently, moved to a different city. The Wandering Healer is a fabricated title, but the scenario it describes is drawn from the documented patterns of minor plagues in Skyrim's lore, small outbreaks that affected individual holds without becoming major historical events. A healer traveling through Falkreath during such an outbreak would keep notes. That is what healers do. They would record the presentation of symptoms, the timeline of progression, the things they tried and the things they did not try, and why. The interesting part of such a document would not be the treatments that worked. It would be the treatments that were not tried. Every healer makes decisions in the field about what is worth attempting. Those decisions are shaped by training, by available materials, by time, by the condition of the patient. What gets left out of the record is often as interesting as what goes in. A healer passing through a town she would never return to, treating people she would never see again, might try things that a permanent resident healer would not risk, or might not try things that seemed too experimental for people she could not follow up with. The notes would end when she left Falkreath. The outbreak would end, or it would not. The people she treated would recover, or they would not. She would be 3 holds away before she knew. That is the particular loneliness of traveling medicine. You do the work, you move on, the outcomes catch up to you only sometimes. The body moves through Skyrim, carrying everything that has ever happened to it. Every illness, every transformation, every season spent in cold that the body was not built for. Most of Skyrim's books do not pay attention to this. They are concerned with power and history and the movements of gods and armies. But the healers were paying attention, the apothecaries, The physicians, who spent their careers looking at what was actually there, in the tissue, in the joint, in the progression of something unwanted, moving through a system that was trying to resist it. They kept notes, careful, plain, unglamorous notes, and far away, across the deserts that most people in Skyrim have never seen, another kind of careful record was being kept, not of the body's failures, of the body's obligations, what it owes, what it carries, what a blade means when it has been named. Hammerfell does not appear on the map you can walk in Skyrim, but the Red Guards who live in Skyrim carry it with them in the way they stand, in the way they hold a blade, in the way they talk about obligation and honor as things that have weight and shape rather than just meaning. Tonight we follow some of what they carried across the sea. The 13 Thrones of Yokuda is a fragmentary text. Pages are missing. Passages break off mid-sentence. What survives reads like something recovered from water damage or fire, coherent in stretches, then suddenly gone. The text describes the warrior kings who ruled Yokuda before it disappeared beneath the sea. 13 distinct dynasties, each with its own relationship to power, each with its own philosophy of governance. The author, writing from memory, it seems, or from oral sources, does not romanticize them. The kings were not all good. Several chapters describe rulers whose ambitions cost their people significantly, but the tone throughout is mourning. Not for the kings specifically, for the fact that these 13 ways of understanding power are now gone, not defeated by a better system, simply gone, along with the continent that produced them. The sea does not care about political philosophy. It does not preserve what it takes. What strikes a careful reader is the specificity of what is remembered. Certain kings are described in detail: their physical appearance, their preferred weapons, a specific decision they made that defined their reign. This level of detail does not come from documents. It comes from a tradition of oral memory so strong that these specific images survived the crossing of an ocean. The Red Guards who sailed to Tamriel brought their dead kings with them in their mouths, in the words they said aloud to each other on the boats, in the dark, crossing water that had swallowed everything they had ever built. The Sword of the Hunt describes a Red Guard's ceremonial practice around the naming of blades. In this tradition, a blade that has been named carries the name as a commitment, not a description, a commitment. When a Red Guard names a sword, they are stating what that sword will be used for, not what it can do, what it will do. The name is a promise made in public, witnessed by community members, recorded in whatever record the community keeps. This has practical implications. A sword named for protection cannot be used for aggression without breaking something in the relationship between the wielder and the blade. The text describes this breaking not as spiritual punishment, but as a loss of alignment. The sword still works mechanically, but something in the partnership between blade and hand no longer functions the way it did. The author describes several historical cases where a named blade was used outside its commitment. In each case, the text records what the wielder lost. Not always their life, sometimes their reputation, sometimes their own sense of who they were. A blade that has been named is not just a tool. It is a record of what you said you would do with it. Most swords in Skyrim have no names. They are picked up, used, and discarded. The Red Guard reading this practice would find that difficult to understand, not judgmentally, just genuinely. A blade without a name has no commitment behind it. No one is responsible for what it does. A Red Guard's Guide to War is not what its title suggests. It is not a tactics manual. There are no formations, no supply line strategies, no advice about terrain. It is a philosophical text about when war is just, written by a Red Guard who had fought in several conflicts and spent the years afterward thinking carefully about which of them he was right to participate in and which he was not. He does not arrive at comfortable conclusions. He does not declare that the wars he fought were all justified, or that any clear line separates the just ones from the unjust ones. He works through cases. He describes situations where the initial cause was just, but the conduct became something else. He describes situations where he could not determine the justice of a cause at all, but participated anyway because the people next to him needed him there. He is honest about the difference between a principled decision and a relational one. He chose to fight sometimes because of argument and sometimes because of loyalty. He is not sure, looking back, that loyalty without argument is a sound basis for violence. He is also not sure that argument without loyalty produces the kind of soldier who is actually useful to the people who need protection. The book does not resolve these tensions. It presents them clearly, carefully, with the patience of someone who has been thinking about this for a long time. It is one of the more honest books about war in all of Skyrim. The Red Kitchen Reader announces itself as a cookbook. It has recipes, real ones, with ingredients and preparation methods. The food is Redguard, in style, specific spices, specific combinations, a relationship with heat and complexity that reflects a cuisine developed in desert conditions. But the introduction is not about food. The introduction describes a battle, specifically a battle that occurred during the Redguard crossing from Yokuda that is not recorded in any other text available in Skyrim. A rearguard action during the crossing, fought on the water, against an enemy the introduction identifies only as those who did not want them to arrive. The battle is described in the same register as the recipes, precise, clear, without drama. The author notes who was lost, what they were carrying, what the sea looked like at the time, and how long it took before the ships were safe enough to continue. Then the introduction ends, and the first recipe begins. The juxtaposition is not accidental. The cookbook was compiled by a community that understood that survival requires both: the battle to get here, the food to stay. The knowledge of how to cook for your people is not separate from the knowledge of how to protect them. Both are survival. Both deserve the same careful documentation. The True Nature of Orcs was written by a Redguard scholar, unusual enough on its own, who spent a year living in an orc stronghold and came back with different opinions than he had when he arrived. He is honest in the opening pages about what he expected to find. His expectations were shaped by common assumptions about orcs, their relationship to Malakath, their warrior culture, the way outsiders were generally received. He expected a certain kind of hardness, a certain kind of closed-off pride. What he found was more complicated. The stronghold he lived in was ruled by specific and sophisticated social rules, not brutal ones, functional ones. Rules that had evolved over generations to solve the specific problems of a community living in close quarters in difficult terrain with limited resources. The rules were sometimes harsh, but they were not arbitrary. He also found humor, dry, internal, very fast. And he found a relationship to craft, particularly metalwork, that he describes as the most demanding standard of excellence he had ever encountered. The orcs he lived with did not make things for beauty. They made things to last. These were not the same goal. Choosing lasting over beautiful is itself a philosophy. He came back with questions he had not left with. That is his summary of the year. He went to observe and came back with questions. That is usually what happens when a person actually pays attention. Night Falls on Sentinel is a mystery story. Someone died. A detective investigates. Clues accumulate. The structure is familiar. But in the background of the mystery, in the descriptions of where the detective goes, who has authority to let him through certain doors, how decisions get made about what information is public and what is not, is a detailed picture of how Redguard political life worked in a major Hammerfell city. The detective moves through layers of authority. He encounters old families whose influence predates the current government. He navigates relationships between the merchant class and the warrior class that have their own long history of tension and accommodation. He deals with religious authorities whose jurisdiction overlaps with civic authority in ways that nobody has ever formally resolved. This is not background color. The mystery depends on these relationships. The solution requires understanding who has power over whom and why. A reader who is only following the plot gets the mystery. A reader who is also watching the politics gets a complete picture of Sentinel. The mystery is never definitively solved. The final chapter leaves two possibilities open and provides evidence for both. This frustrated readers who wanted resolution. It is also in a city where power is distributed, the way the book describes, the most realistic possible ending. Varieties of faith. The Red Guards is a short text. It summarizes the gods of the Red Guard people with the economy of a reference document. Each god gets a paragraph, their domain, their relationship to other divine figures, the form their worship takes. Most of the entries are compact and informative, but the entry for Hunding is different. Hunding is described not as a god who did things, but as a god who was a thing. Specifically, the text states that Hunding was the act of crossing. The Red Guards crossed the sea from Yokuda to Tamriel. That crossing the physical act, the sustained movement across water toward an unknown shore, became divine, not a god who helped them cross. The crossing itself, made holy by what it cost and what it meant. This is a different kind of theology than most races in Tamriel practice. Most gods are beings. Hunding is an event, a moment of collective action so significant that it persisted as a spiritual presence long after the moment was over. The text notes that Hunding can manifest again when his people face a situation that requires the same quality of commitment the original crossing demanded. Not a fixed deity in a fixed realm, a recurring presence called into being by necessity. The sea that swallowed Yokuda is gone, but what it required of the people who crossed it is still here. It became a god. It is still watching. The Red Guards carried more across the sea than their bodies and their blades. They carried their kings in their mouths and their battles in their cookbooks and their theology in the memory of an ocean crossing. Memory in Tamriel is not just personal, it is communal. It is something a people holds together, each one carrying a piece of it, passing it forward so that nothing important has to be lost. The Red Guards understood this very well. They built their lore on it. They named their swords by it. They made a god out of it. And across Skyrim, in the cities and the courts and the administrative buildings where different kinds of records were kept, another kind of memory was being maintained. Not personal, not communal, official. The kind of memory that gets written into policy, that decides what gets counted and what does not, that turns the complexity of actual life into a document someone can file. The difference between those two kinds of memory is a long story. Tonight, we begin it. The empire ran on paper, not on swords, not on faith, not on the personal authority of any one emperor, on documents, on forms filled out in triplicate and filed in rooms that nobody visited unless something had gone wrong. Most of those documents are not interesting, but some of them are. And the interesting ones are interesting precisely because they were not supposed to be. The Talos mistake is a fabricated title, but the debate it represents was real within imperial history. The question of whether Tiber Septim, the man who became Talos, should have been elevated to godhood was not universally settled the moment it was declared. There were voices inside the imperial apparatus who had reservations, who thought the precedent was dangerous, who worried about what it meant to make a god out of a man who had living enemies, living descendants, and a specific political legacy that was still actively shaping policy. A document recording that internal debate would read differently from the official declarations. It would not be about faith. It would be about governance, about the risks of attaching divine authority to a figure whose mortal decisions were still being contested in courts and histories. The concerns it would raise are the ones that eventually became relevant under the White Gold Concordat. When the Aldmeri Dominion demanded the removal of Talos from the Pantheon, the Empire complied. That compliance was possible, in part, because there had always been people within the imperial structure who had never been entirely comfortable with the elevation in the first place. They did not oppose faith. They opposed the specific complications of this faith. The document that recorded their discomfort was not heroic. It was cautious, bureaucratic, the kind of concern that gets written in careful language and filed somewhere where it can be retrieved if the situation ever requires it. The situation eventually required it. By then, the document had been in a file for centuries. An overview of gods and worship in the empire is exactly as dry as its title suggests. It is an administrative summary of religious practice across imperial territories, which gods are worshipped where, in what forms, by what portions of the population. It was compiled for policy purposes, to help administrators understand the religious landscape of the territories they governed. Most of it is straightforward, but there is a footnote on page 11, not in the main text, not highlighted, just a footnote at the bottom of a page about miracle verification that contains something worth stopping for. The footnote describes a practice within the imperial priesthood for evaluating claimed miracles, not theological evaluation, administrative evaluation. A panel of priests would review accounts of miraculous events and determine which ones would be entered into official record and which ones would be classified as unverified reports. The footnote does not call this deciding which miracles were real. It uses language about standardization and record integrity, but the practical function is identical. A miracle that the panel did not endorse did not become part of the official religious record. It remained an informal account, heard, possibly believed, but not ratified. The gods of the empire performed miracles subject to imperial administrative approval. This is not stated anywhere in the main text. It is in a footnote, in a document almost nobody reads. Someone put it there. Someone knew it belonged somewhere on the record, even if not somewhere prominent. Commentaries on the Mysterium Xerxes presents an unusual problem. The Mysterium Xerxes is the book written by Mehrunes Dagon, a genuinely dangerous Daedric text that causes harm to those who read it unprepared. It exists in the game, it is real within the lore, and it presents an obvious scholarly challenge. How do you write about a book you cannot safely read? The imperial scholar who wrote the commentaries solved this problem by not reading it. This is stated plainly in the opening pages. He describes his methodology, which involved collecting accounts from people who had read portions of the text, cross-referencing those accounts with each other, and supplementing them with what could be determined from the physical object, without engaging with the content directly. The result is a document about a document. Second-hand knowledge carefully assembled into something that resembles analysis. The scholar is aware of the limitations. He notes them repeatedly. He distinguishes carefully between what was reported by multiple independent sources and what was reported by only one. He flags the places where accounts conflict and does not resolve the conflicts he cannot resolve. What he produced is less useful than a direct reading of the Xerxes would be. He knew this. He did it anyway, because someone needed to write about it, and doing it this way meant staying alive to finish the document. There is a kind of professional honor in that choice. The work was limited. It was honest about its limits, and it exists, which a more ambitious approach might not have allowed. Provinces of Tamriel is a geography reference text. It describes each province in turn: terrain, climate, major settlements, economic character. Most of the entries are balanced and informative, but the section on Skyrim is different from the others in a specific way. The other provincial entries read with confidence. Somerset Isle is described with authority. Morrowind's entry is detailed and assured, but Skyrim's entry is hesitant. It qualifies itself frequently. It describes things as difficult to determine and notes that conditions vary significantly from one area to another. The author spent time in Skyrim. This is evident from the specific observations, but those observations are followed again and again by admissions that what he observed in one hold did not seem to apply in the next one, that the people he spoke to in one city described their neighbors in ways that those neighbors did not recognize, that the land itself seemed to resist the kind of summary he had been able to apply elsewhere. He concludes the Skyrim entry with a sentence that does not appear in any other section of the book. He writes that Skyrim is best understood not as a place, but as a collection of places that have agreed, for administrative purposes, to share a name. He was not being dismissive, he was being accurate, and he was honest enough to write it down in an official geography text, which took a certain amount of professional courage. The Empire administered Skyrim for centuries. The province's text suggests it never entirely understood it. The Imperial Census of Daedra Lords is one of the more remarkable documents available in Skyrim, and one of the least remarked upon. It is exactly what it sounds like. The Empire catalogued the Daedric princes, not their realms in any deep theological sense, their names, their domains, their known relationships with mortal populations, their historical patterns of intervention in imperial affairs. The kind of information you would compile if you needed to govern in a world where these entities existed and occasionally became relevant to civic management. The tone is the extraordinary thing. It is the tone of a municipal works document. Here are the known entities. Here are their domains. Here are the incidents in which they have intersected with imperial territory. Here is what was done in response. Nocturnal gets a paragraph. Mehrunes Dagon gets 2. There are notes about which princes have historically been cooperative with imperial interests and which have not. There is a brief section on response protocols when Daedric activity is reported in a hold. The Empire did not pretend the Daedric princes did not exist. It filed them. It created a reference document so that administrators would know what they were dealing with if a situation arose. It treated the Lords of Oblivion the way it treated difficult weather or unstable road conditions. Something to be noted, something to be managed if possible, something to be worked around if not. This is either deeply impressive or slightly absurd. Probably both. On the Great Collapse is an imperial assessment of what happened to the College of Winterhold when most of the city fell into the sea. It is a careful document, carefully written in a way that takes some attention to notice. The collapse happened. This is not disputed. The coastline of Winterhold changed dramatically in a short period. The city largely fell. The college survived. The relationship between these facts, why the college survived when the city did not, is the central, unresolved question. The Imperial report addresses this question by not quite addressing it. It describes the physical event in detail. It documents the loss of life and property. It records the subsequent decline of Winterhold as a functioning hold. And then, in the section where analysis would normally appear, it pivots to administrative response, what the Empire did afterward, how resources were allocated, what the official position was. The question of why the college survived is not answered. It is noted, briefly, as a matter of ongoing inquiry, and then the document moves on. There is a reason for this. The available explanations for the college's survival all implicate magic in ways that would require the Empire to take a position on the college's responsibility. The Imperial report was not written to take that position. It was written to document response and avoid culpability. The document is thorough about everything it intends to be thorough about. The gap at the center is not an oversight. It is the most deliberate thing in the text. Beggar Prince is a story. It follows a prince who loses his wealth and title and is forced to live among the poor of a large city. He learns things. He returns to power changed. This is a familiar structure. It has appeared in literature across many cultures for a long time, but the specific details of how the city's poor population is managed in this story are not invented. They match, with reasonable precision, an imperial policy approach to urban population management that was in effect during parts of the Second Era. The policy concerned what to do when a city's lower population grew large enough to present what the administrative documents called a stability concern. The solutions described in the story work programs, relocation incentives, specific kinds of charitable distribution designed to keep people moving rather than gathering in permanent settlements. These were real approaches, encoded in a story about a prince learning humility, but real. The story was distributed widely. It was considered uplifting. A prince who learns to see his people, a ruler transformed by contact with ordinary life. What it was doing at the same time, in the same text, for a different reader, was explaining policy in a form that felt like entertainment. Both readings are accurate. The story is genuinely about a prince learning something. The policy is genuinely encoded in the details. The two things coexist in the same document, without either one cancelling the other. Someone wrote it that way on purpose. The document does not record who. The empire was built on the assumption that the world could be understood through documentation. That if you named something, catalogued it, filed it correctly, you had brought it under a kind of control. Not complete control, but enough. Skyrim resisted this. The Daedric princes declined to stay in their files. Miracles happened, or they did not, regardless of what the panel decided. The college survived in ways the report could not explain without creating problems. The paper continued regardless. The forms were filled out. The footnotes were written. The gaps were left where the gaps had to be left. And in the strongholds beyond the hold cities, in the places the Empire's census takers rarely visited, a different kind of law was being kept, not written in documents, written in the code of a people who had decided that what they needed could not be filed or catalogued or administered from a distance. What they needed was simpler than that, and harder. The strongholds sit in the hills, away from the hold cities. No gates that welcome strangers. No markets open to anyone who passes through. A way of living that does not ask for imperial recognition and does not particularly want it. The books that describe this way of living are short. The orcs who wrote them did not waste words. The Orsinium Pact is a brief document. It records an agreement reached between orc leaders and Breton authorities during one of the periods when Orsinium, the orc homeland, was formally recognized as a territory. The pact outlines boundaries, obligations, and protections. It uses the careful language of treaty-making. Both parties agreed. Both parties signed. Orsinium was destroyed within a generation. Reading the pact knowing this gives the document a quality that its authors could not have intended. Every clause that begins with the phrase, "both parties agree," now reads as a record of a promise that was broken. Every protection guaranteed by the pact was subsequently not provided. Every boundary acknowledged in the text was subsequently crossed. The document did not fail because of poor drafting. It failed because the will to honor it was not present on one side. The Bretons who signed it were under political pressure from other quarters. The orcs who signed it had fewer options than the text implied they had. A treaty is only as durable as the commitment behind it. The Orsinium Pact records the commitment in careful language. What it cannot record is the absence of commitment that was there from the beginning on one side of the table. The orcs have rebuilt Orsinium multiple times. Each time it has been destroyed. The pact was not the last attempt at formal recognition. It was one in a series. They kept trying. They kept being answered the same way. Mauloc, Orc Father, is a religious text that presents a view of Malakath significantly different from the standard Daedric categorization. The standard view, held by imperial scholars and most non-orc theologians, is that Malakath is a Daedric prince, a powerful entity who resides in the ash pit, who was once the Aldmeri spirit Trinimac, before being consumed and transformed by Boethia. The text does not dispute this history, but it frames it differently. In this framing, what matters is not the theological category. What matters is the relationship. Malakath is not worshipped as a distant prince who grants power in exchange for devotion. He is treated as an ancestor, someone who suffered a profound humiliation, who was diminished and changed by an enemy, and who kept going anyway. This is the quality the text emphasizes, not power, endurance. The orcs who follow Malakath are not following a god of strength in any simple sense. They are following a god who knows what it is to be defeated and degraded, and who chose to continue existing on his own terms after that happened. There is a specific theology in this that the Daedric classification misses entirely. The Ashpit is not a throne room. It is a place where the unwanted and the outcast end up. Malakath rules it not as a conqueror, but as the king of everything that was thrown away. His people understood this. That is why they followed him. The Code of Malakath is short. It is the shortest text in this chapter, and it is worth quoting the structure of it, if not the specific words, because the structure is the point. The code covers combat and when it is permitted, marriage and what obligations it creates, cowardice and how it is addressed. No, theft within the stronghold, and the distinction between taking what you need and taking what belongs to someone else, hospitality, and what is owed to a traveller who presents no threat, the death of a stronghold member, and what duties follow. That is the complete scope of orc law as the code presents it. 6 categories, each one addressed in direct, unambiguous terms, no subclauses, no exceptions for rank or family connection. The orc chief is bound by the same code as the youngest member of the stronghold. The contrast with imperial law is not subtle. Imperial law fills volumes. It has exceptions and precedents and interpretive traditions and administrative bodies dedicated to navigating its complexity. The Code of Malakath assumes that complexity is itself a problem, that a law simple enough to remember is better than a law comprehensive enough to game. Whether this is correct is a matter of what you think law is for. The code is not designed to handle every situation. It is designed to make clear what is expected of a person in the situations that come up most often. Everything else, it trusts judgment to handle. The true nature of orcs was examined in the previous chapter for what it revealed about orc society from the outside. Here the focus is on what it reveals, specifically about stronghold architecture and the daily structure of stronghold life. The Redguard scholar, who spent a year in the stronghold, noticed that the physical layout was not arbitrary. The forge occupied the center, not the chief's longhouse, not a shrine to Malakath, not a communal eating area, the forge, the place where metal is worked. He spent several pages thinking about what this means. His conclusion was that for the stronghold he lived in, craft was not a support function. It was the primary function, the combat readiness of the stronghold, the trading relationships with outside communities, the internal hierarchy and the way respect was earned and maintained. All of it ran through the quality of what was made at the forge. A master smith in this stronghold had more practical authority than the scholar initially expected, not more authority than the chief. But the chief consulted the smith in ways that made clear the smith's opinion carried weight that went beyond their role. The stronghold was organized around making things, good things, things that lasted. The architecture reflected this. The social structure reflected this. The orcs who built it had decided what mattered most and built their entire world around that decision. The scholar found this clarifying. He had expected a warrior culture in the simple sense. What he found was a maker culture that happened to include warriors. Mages and orcs is a fabricated title, but the tension it describes is documented throughout Elder Scrolls lore. The traditional orc stronghold does not welcome magic. This is not a matter of ignorance or fear exactly. It is a matter of values. The Code of Malakath deals in direct things: combat, obligation, honesty, magic. Particularly the schools of illusion and conjuration operates through indirection. You make someone believe something false. You summon power from outside yourself rather than developing it within yourself. From a stronghold perspective, this is not just useless. It is contrary to the values the stronghold is built on. An orc who wanted to study magic would face this not as a ban from authority, but as a question of compatibility. What they wanted to do did not fit inside the framework they lived in. They would need to choose between the two. Most strongholds would not force the choice directly. They would simply make it clear, through the ordinary texture of daily life, that one path was visible and valued, and the other was not. Some orcs left the strongholds for the cities and the colleges. They learned what they wanted to learn. They were not always welcomed back. The text that would record this experience honestly would not be angry. It would be about a specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of wanting something your community has no framework for. Of being drawn toward a path that is not forbidden, but simply has no place in the world you were born into. Some of them found their place elsewhere. Some of them kept looking. Varieties of Faith. The Orcs is the shortest entry in the Varieties of Faith series. This is appropriate. The Orc relationship with their gods is not complicated by extensive theology or competing interpretive traditions. It is direct. Malakath is primary. He is not asked for mercy. The text notes this specifically. Orc prayer does not request forgiveness, relief from suffering, or divine intervention in personal difficulties. What is asked for is strength to endure, clarity to see the situation accurately, and, occasionally, the grace to die in a way that means something. The text notes one other god worth mentioning in the Orc context. Mauloc, which is another name for Malakath, in a different tradition, is sometimes distinguished from Malakath in older texts, treated as a separate ancestor figure rather than the Daedric prince. The relationship between the two figures is not resolved in the scholarship. The Orcs who were asked about it tended to respond that the distinction was not one they found useful. The gods you need are few if you are clear about what you need them for. The Orcs were clear. They did not pray for easy things. They prayed for enough. Songs of the Return is a lengthy text documenting the Atmoran migration to Skyrim, the waves of settlers who came south from the frozen continent and established the foundations of Nordic culture. Most of the text deals with conflict and conquest, but one excerpt describes something different, an encounter between an early Atmoran group and an Orc stronghold in the hills east of what would later become Whiterun. The Atmorans had been in Skyrim for several years at this point. They had fought many things. They were not naive about the territory. The encounter with the stronghold did not become a battle. The text records that the Atmoran leader approached the stronghold's boundary marker and waited. He did not approach further. He waited until someone came out to see what he wanted. What followed was a conversation. The text does not record the full content. It records only that it lasted through most of a day and ended with both groups returning to their respective camps without having fought and without a formal agreement of any kind. The excerpt includes one line about what the Atmoran leader said afterward to his people. He said that the Orcs they had spoken with were people who had already decided what they were. He meant this as a form of respect. People who have decided what they are do not need to prove it. The stronghold is not named. The Orc leader is not named. The conversation is not preserved. Just the fact that it happened and ended quietly, and that someone thought it was worth including in a record of the migration. Not every encounter becomes a story about violence. Some of them become a single sentence about a long conversation and a quiet walk back to camp. The strongholds are still in the hills. The forge still burns at the center. The code is still short. The gods are still few, and the prayers are still direct. The empire filed its documents. The cities built their walls. The guilds made their rules, and the colleges made their arguments, and the priests made their footnotes about which miracles were real. The stronghold stayed outside all of that and continued doing what they had always done, making things, enduring things, being clear about what they were. And further back in time, before the current races had their current forms, before the empire existed to file anything, the first elves were also making choices about what they would become. Different choices, made differently, for reasons that are only partly legible now. But those choices are still visible. In the races that exist today, in the ones that almost nobody remembers, existed. Before the Altmer, the Dunmer, the Bosmer, the Falmer, before any of the elven races, as they currently exist, there were the Altmer, one people, or something close to one people. They changed. They chose to change, or they were changed, or change found them, and they responded to it differently, depending on who they were and where they lived. Tonight we look at what they were before, and some of what they became. Before the Ages of Man is one of the foundational lore texts of the Elder Scrolls world. It describes the earliest periods of Tamrielic history in broad strokes: the arrival of the Aldmer, the first settlements, the beginning of the processes that would eventually produce the current racial diversity of the continent. The detail worth sitting with is the description of the Aldmer not as a conquered people or a scattered people, but as a people who chose to differentiate. They were not forced apart by external pressure, at least not initially. They moved into different environments, and those environments began to shape them. And then, at some point, they began to consciously accelerate those changes. The Altmer stayed closest to the original Aldmer form, or believed they did, and built an entire civilization on that belief. The Bosmer adapted to the forests of Valenwood and entered into a relationship with those forests that changed them over generations. The Falmer went north into the cold and the dark and changed most dramatically of all. Each divergence was a choice, compounded by circumstance, compounded by time. After enough centuries, the choices had become biology. The circumstances had become culture. The time had made everything feel inevitable that had originally been contingent. The Aldmer who first arrived in Tamriel could not have predicted any of it. They were one people, looking at a large continent. They dispersed, they adapted, they became. The text records this without judgment. It is simply what happened. The Changed Ones is a Dunmer religious text. It describes the transformation of the Chimer, the ancestors of the Dunmer, from their original Aldmer form into something different. The agent of this change was Boethia. The mechanism was not conquest or force, but something closer to persuasion and revelation. The Chimer followed Boethia away from the Aldmer traditions. They abandoned the worship of the original Aldmeri pantheon and took up a new relationship with different powers. And over time, this spiritual shift expressed itself physically. They became the Chimer gold-skinned, distinct, carrying in their bodies the evidence of the path they had chosen. The text is written as praise. This is the official framing. The Chimer made a brave choice. They left behind what was comfortable and familiar and followed something truer. The transformation is presented as liberation, but read slowly. It also reads as a warning. The text is very specific about what was given up, the connections to the old traditions, the relationship with certain divine figures that the Aldmer had maintained for thousands of years, the particular kind of safety that comes from belonging to a long continuity. All of this was traded for something. The text says the trade was worth it, but it lists what was given with such specificity that a reader can feel the weight of it. A text that praises a choice but lists every cost of that choice in detail is doing something more complicated than simple praise. Whether the authors intended this or not, it is what the text does. The Malmer are almost never mentioned in Skyrim. There is no reason for the average person in the hold cities to know they exist. They live far away in the tropical archipelago of Pyandania, south of Somerset Isle. They have been at war with the Altmer for thousands of years. They are elves whose history diverged so long ago and so completely that they do not look like other elves anymore. Their skin has changed. Their magic has particular qualities not found in other elven traditions, particularly in relation to serpents and sea creatures. A text describing them for a Tamrielic audience would begin with the basic facts and then encounter a problem. The basic facts are almost all that is available. The Malmer do not appear in Tamrielic scholarship with any frequency, because Tamrielic scholars rarely went to Pyandania and rarely came back if they did. What exists is fragmentary. Reported by Altmer sources, which have obvious reasons for presenting the Malma in particular ways, filtered through a long history of conflict that colors every account. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that they exist, that they have a culture sophisticated enough to sustain thousands of years of organized conflict with one of Tamriel's most powerful civilizations, that their relationship with the sea is different from any other elven relationship with any environment, and that they are mer-elves, whose history is so separate from the main Tamrielic story that most Tamrielic residents have never heard of them. They are out there, in the warm water south of everything, still fighting a war most people do not know is happening. The chapter on Elven racial phylogeny in the Notes on Racial Phylogeny text extends the biological argument from the earlier chapter into specifically Elven territory. The author's claim is that all current Elven races share a common ancestor. This is not controversial in broad outline. The Aldmer origin is generally acknowledged. What the author adds is a further claim about that common ancestor. He argues that the Aldmer themselves were not native to Tamriel, that they arrived from somewhere else, that their biological distinctiveness from Tamriel's other inhabitants suggests an origin point outside the continent and, possibly, outside the world as it currently exists. He is careful about this claim. He presents the biological evidence first and lets it speak before he makes the interpretive leap. The evidence is genuinely unusual certain features of elven physiology that do not have analogues in any other Tamrielic life form, which require explanation either as independent evolution or as evidence of a different origin. The text does not identify where the Aldmer came from before Tamriel. It only notes that the biological record is inconsistent with them having originated here. The mythological record suggests Aldmeris, a lost elven homeland. The author notes that if Aldmeris was a real place and not a mythological concept, its location has never been established. He ends the chapter with a question rather than a conclusion. He does this deliberately. The question is, if the Aldmer came from somewhere, what were they before they arrived? The question has not been answered. The text simply leaves it there. The Aldmer calendar is fragmentary. Large portions are missing. What survives shows a system for measuring time that does not align with any calendar currently in use in Tamriel. The surviving sections list dates corresponding to events. Some of those events are recognizable there, are dates that seem to correspond to things recorded in the historical record under different calendars, but others do not match anything known. Dates are listed with descriptions of significant events that have no corresponding entry in any history. There are two possible explanations. One is that the events recorded on those dates simply did not make it into the historical record, that they were local or minor, or that the records were lost. The other is that the dates describe events that have not happened yet, and that the Aldmer calendar was not purely retrospective. Elder Scrolls lore does suggest that certain ancient peoples had relationships with time that were not strictly linear. The connection between the Aldmer and the Etarda, the ancient spirits who became gods or disappeared, would give them access to knowledge that moved in non-standard directions. The calendar does not explain itself. It lists dates and events, and then, in the missing sections, goes silent. What was on those pages is unknown. Whether the missing sections contain the most significant dates, or the least, cannot be determined. The dates that survive sit in their column, attached to events that may have happened or may be waiting to happen. The calendar does not distinguish between the two. Song of Pelinal, Volume 3, is the volume that most people skip. The song exists in multiple volumes, each focusing on different aspects of Pelinal Whitestrake, the ancient warrior figure who fought alongside Alessia against the Aelid oppressors in the early First Era. The earlier volumes are more dramatic, more suited to the song's epic register. Volume 3 is quieter and more disturbing. It focuses on Pelinal's relationship with elves, not the Aelids, specifically all elves. The hatred described in this volume is not tactical. It is not a military calculation about an enemy. It is personal in a way that the text circles around without quite explaining. Pelinal kills elves with a totality that goes beyond what the military situation requires. His companions note this. They are not comfortable with it. The text records their discomfort alongside their continued alliance with him. They need him, and he is on their side. But what they are watching is something other than war. The volume contains one passage where Pelinal himself speaks about it. He does not explain the hatred. He describes it as something he carries, something that was in him before the war, something the war gave him a use for. This suggests a history the other volumes do not record, something that happened before the Alessian rebellion, something personal between Pelinal and the elven races, or between Pelinal and something the elves represented to him. The text does not say what it was. It only says the hatred was old, older than the war it expressed itself through. Frontier, conquest, and accommodation is a historical text about the early period of Aldmeri expansion into Tamriel. It describes the movement of tribes from the coasts inland, the establishment of early settlements, the encounters with the other peoples and creatures already present on the continent. The title is the argument, frontier, the condition of entering unknown territory, conquest, the taking of it, accommodation, the adjustment to what could not simply be taken. The text tracks all three phases for different Aldmeri groups. Some expanded easily into empty or thinly populated terrain. Others encountered resistance and conquered it. Others found things they could not conquer: terrain, climate, magical conditions, populations with their own power, and had to accommodate. The routes they never returned from are recorded in a specific section near the end, areas where Aldmeri exploration parties went and were not heard from again. The text is careful not to speculate about what happened to them. It simply notes the direction of travel and the absence of any return record. Some of those routes went north. Some went into interior regions that are, in the present day of Skyrim, still considered difficult or dangerous. Some went south into territory that is not well documented in any subsequent historical record. They went somewhere. Something received them. What the exchange was is not in any surviving account. The text records their departure. The space after that is empty. Something is always in the space that the records leave empty. The Aldmer knew this. They went looking anyway. And underneath all of this, underneath the races and the calendars, and the routes that ended without record, is the world itself, the water that runs through it, the weather that moves across it, the particular quality of cold that settles into certain valleys and does not leave. Some books paid attention to that too. Skyrim is not just a place where things happen. It is a thing itself, a living system of cold and water and stone that was here before anyone arrived and will be here after everyone leaves. Most books in Skyrim treat the land as background. Tonight we read the ones that treated it as the subject. The Holds of Skyrim is usually read for its political and administrative content, the hold structure, the Jarl system, the relationships between cities and their surrounding territories. That reading is valid. But there is another way to read the same text. Read it for climate instead of politics, and a different picture emerges. Each hold has its own relationship with cold, not just its own temperature, its own character of cold. The cold in the Pale is flat and continuous. It does not intensify dramatically. It simply does not stop. Travelers in the Pale do not describe storms or sudden drops. They describe a steady, patient cold that accumulates over days until the body has forgotten what warmth felt like. The cold in the Reach is different. It comes in from the mountains in specific ways, funneled by the terrain into valleys where it concentrates. The same day can be survivable on a ridge and dangerous in a canyon below it. The Reach's cold is directional. It has geography. Eastmarch is warmer than it should be, given its northern position. The hot springs distribute heat through the ground in patterns that create microclimates across the hold. Certain areas of Eastmarch support plant life that has no business existing that far north. The ground itself is warm in places. You can feel it through your boots. The holds are not just administrative divisions, they are climates. The people who grew up in each one developed different relationships with cold, different building practices, different agricultural knowledge. The political map and the climate map describe the same territory in completely different terms. Both maps are accurate, they are just answering different questions. The Herbalist's Guide to Skyrim was examined earlier for what it revealed about wartime supply requests. But the seasonal notes in the back of the guide are worth separate attention. Most herbalists document when plants bloom and fruit and go dormant. Standard seasonal tracking. The guide does this too. But there are entries in the back section that fall outside the standard seasonal categories entirely. Several plants, the author notes, only appear reliably during a specific 3-day window following a significant blizzard, not after any snowfall. After a blizzard defined in the guide by specific conditions of wind speed and accumulation, the plants do not simply emerge from under the snow. They appear in places where the blizzard's wind has disturbed the soil in particular ways. On the lee side of rocks, along the edges of snowdrifts, where the boundary between buried and exposed ground creates a specific moisture and temperature condition. The author spent years tracking this. She documented which blizzards produced the plants and which did not. She noted the differences between productive blizzards and unproductive ones in enough detail to develop a predictive framework. If the wind came from the northeast and the accumulation reached a certain depth, the plants would appear within 3 days of the storm's end. She could plan her collection routes around this. What she was documenting, without using this language, was a relationship between violence and growth. The most disruptive weather events created the conditions for something delicate and specific. The blizzard was not just damage, it was preparation. The guide is a practical document, but this section of it is also, quietly, an observation about how the world replenishes itself. History of Raven Rock is a text about the settlement on Solstheim, the island off Skyrim's northeastern coast. Raven Rock was established as an imperial mining settlement. It was practical in its origins. The ash from Red Mountain had enriched the soil in ways that made certain kinds of extraction profitable. But the text follows what happened over generations as the settlers lived in and with that ash-altered environment. The soil grew things that other soils did not. The food that grew from it had different properties. The people who ate that food, generation after generation, developed different physical tendencies, not dramatic transformation, gradual adjustment. And then the text traces something harder to document. The beliefs of the Raven Rock settlers shifted over time in ways that parallel the physical shifts. Their relationship with death changed, influenced partly by proximity to Dunmer culture, but also by something in the environment itself. The ash preserved things. Objects left in it lasted longer than they should have. Bodies buried in it did not decompose at normal rates. The ground was not neutral, it was active. A people that lives in active ground begins to think differently about what the ground contains, about what persists, about the relationship between what is buried and what continues. The text does not argue that the ash caused the belief changes directly. It only notes that the changes happened and that the ash was always present. The correlation is there. The causation is left as an open question. The settlement still stands. The ash is still there. The ground is still doing what the ground does. Rivers of Profit and Peril is a merchant's guide to Skyrim's waterways. It covers which rivers are navigable, which are seasonal, which carry dangerous currents, and which have historically been used for trade. Practical, precise, the kind of document that earns its keep by being accurate. But there is a section near the middle that the author clearly struggled with. He is precise about everything else in the guide. He qualified things carefully when he was uncertain. And in this section, he is uncertain, and he says so plainly. Several rivers in Skyrim flow in directions that the surrounding terrain does not explain. Water runs downhill. This is not complicated. The shape of the land determines where water goes. But there are stretches of certain Skyrim rivers where the water is moving in a direction that the local topography cannot account for. The grade is wrong. The elevation differences do not support the direction of flow. The author documented these stretches. He measured them. He talked to local people who had lived along these rivers their entire lives, and they confirmed what he was seeing without being able to explain it either. The water has always gone that way. It has always gone that way. He considered several explanations: underground channels affecting surface flow, historical changes to the terrain that created anomalous grades, magical influence from ruins or artifacts beneath the riverbed. He could not confirm any of them. He published the observation without the explanation because the observation was real, even without an explanation. Some of those rivers are still flowing the wrong way. The land has not changed its answer. The Great War is primarily a military and political history. It documents the conflict between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion, the battles, the treaties, the political consequences. It is not a text that most people read for environmental detail. But there is a passage, brief and easily skipped, that notes something the military historians included because it was operationally relevant and apparently forgot to remove from the final text when it stopped being operationally relevant. The passage notes that during the fighting in 3 specific holds, the movement of armies across river terrain, combined with certain siege and destruction activities, altered the courses of several rivers. Bridges were destroyed. Fords were blocked. In some cases, channels were deliberately redirected to create obstacles or flooding for tactical purposes. After the war, those rivers did not all return to their previous courses. The alterations had been thorough enough that the new courses became stable, and the passage notes, with the brevity of something mentioned almost as an afterthought, that several areas of those holds have not been formally remapped since the conflict. This means there are places in Skyrim where the official maps show rivers that no longer exist in the locations marked and do not show rivers that are actually there. Administrative documents refer to fords and crossing points that have not functioned in decades. Local knowledge and official record have diverged, and no one with the authority to update the official record has considered it a priority. The land changed. The paper did not. The Wolf Queen is a multi-volume historical novel about Patima Septim, one of the more formidable and ruthless figures in imperial history. Book 1 opens in solitude. It is winter. The opening description of solitude in winter is the only extended treatment of the city's physical relationship with seasonal weather available in the game. Most descriptions of solitude focus on its architecture, its political character, its position on the cliff above the sea. The Wolf Queen's author was interested in something more immediate. She describes the city in a specific kind of winter storm. The wind comes in off the water. Solitude's position on its arch of rock means the wind has nothing to interrupt it before it hits the city walls. The author describes what this sounds like from inside a stone building. Not howling, exactly. A sustained pressure that finds every gap, every imperfect seal, every place where stone meets stone, with less than perfect contact. And then she describes the flooding. When the storms are severe enough, water comes up from below the arch, not rain from above water from the sea, pushed up through fissures in the stone by the pressure of the waves. The city has drainage channels cut specifically for this. The author describes them in enough detail to make clear she had seen them herself. Old channels, worn smooth, cut by hands that understood this would always be a problem. Solitude is built on rock above the sea. The sea reminds it of this regularly. The drainage channels are still there. They were cut for exactly what they are used for. The medical text on werewolves was examined earlier for its clinical description of physical transformation. But one section deals specifically with the relationship between transformation and season. It is short, and it is the section most worth reading slowly. The author noted, across years of treating lycanthropes, that the full moon in winter and the full moon in summer did not produce identical outcomes. The transformation itself was the same mechanically, but the recovery differed. Winter transformations were harder to come back from. The body lost heat during recovery that summer. Metabolism replaced quickly, and winter metabolism replaced slowly. The period of vulnerability after transformation, when the lycanthrope was in human form, but not fully functional, lasted longer in cold months. She also noted behavioral differences during the transformation itself that she could not fully explain. Winter transformed lycanthropes showed different patterns, less ranging, more stillness. She theorized that the wolf form was responding to winter survival instincts, that the human mind, when suppressed during transformation, did not override. The moon looks the same in winter and summer. The sky it rises in is the same sky, but the body receiving the transformation is a body in winter, a body that has been in cold for months, a body that is conserving things carefully. The world outside gets inside, even when the inside is something as total as a transformation. Even the wolf feels the cold. Skyrim's physical world is not passive. It acts. The rivers go where they choose. The blizzards prepare the ground for what comes after. The ash preserves. The sea pushes up through the stone. The books that paid attention to this were not considered important texts. They were practical guides, medical records, regional histories. They were read for their information and then set aside. But they were also, without intending to be, documents about a world that was alive in ways the official histories did not have time for. The world was always doing something. Most of the books were not watching. A few of them were, and some of what they put on pages was dressed up in simpler clothes, given shorter words, made to look like something a child could read. Some of the most careful observations in Skyrim were hidden in the books that looked the least serious. There is a category of book in Skyrim that looks like one thing and is another. Short pages, simple words, pictures in some editions, the kind of book you hand to a child without reading it yourself first. That is, it turns out, exactly how some things survived that were not supposed to. The cake and the diamond has already appeared in this script, in the chapter on disease. Here the focus is different, not the disease itself, but the decision to hide information about it inside a children's story. The Crimson Scourge, the ancient epidemic whose symptoms the story accurately describes, was not a minor event. It affected large populations. Records of it exist in medical and historical texts, but those texts were not widely distributed. They were scholarly documents, held in libraries, read by people who already knew where to look. The children's story was distributed everywhere. Merchants sold it, parents read it, children heard it repeated, and embedded in the familiar, comfortable structure of a story about a child who finds something beautiful and gives it away before it causes harm. Embedded in that structure were the specific symptoms of a plague. A child who had heard this story would know, without knowing they knew, what early Crimson Scourge looked like. They would know that beautiful things that make the air feel wrong should be given away before the wrongness spreads. They would know the sequence. Color changes first, then sound, then warmth becoming its opposite. This is public health information delivered as bedtime story. Someone understood that the safest place to store knowledge that everyone needed was inside a form that everyone encountered. The diamond in the story is cold and wrong and beautiful. The child knows immediately that something is off. That instinct, trust, that feeling, act before you can fully explain it, is the actual lesson. The story taught it to generations of children who had no idea they were being taught anything. A children's annuad simplifies the creation myth for young readers. Gods become approachable. The void becomes something more like a very dark and empty room. The ancient conflicts become something more like a disagreement between very powerful people. But in the middle of this simplification, there is a detail that should not be there. The adult versions of the Annuad describe the creation of the mortal world as the result of divine action and sacrifice. The Etada gave things up. The world was formed from what they gave. This is the standard account. The children's version includes all of this, and then adds one sentence that appears nowhere in the adult versions. A single sentence describing what the world did in the moment it became real, not what the gods did. What the world did. The world, according to this sentence, made a sound, not a dramatic sound. The text describes it as the kind of sound a person makes when they settle into sleep. A small release of something held. A breath let go. This detail, the world exhaling as it became solid, does not correspond to any known theological tradition in Tamriel. It is not in the Anuad. It is not in any variant text. It appears only here, in a children's pamphlet sold at market stalls for almost nothing. Whether it is an invention, an error, or something preserved from a version of the creation myth older than any currently available text, no one has settled the question. The pamphlet does not explain where the detail came from. The world made a sound when it became real, a small one, like settling. Someone thought children should know that. The Fairy is a short story about a tiny glowing creature that lives in a forest. A child finds it. The fairy grants a wish. The child makes a modest, kind wish. Everyone is better off. The end. This is the surface reading. The surface reading is complete and functional as a children's story. It works exactly as presented. But the fairy's behavior, described step by step as it grants the wish, follows a specific sequence that does not belong in a forest story about a wish-granting creature. The sequence, the fairy's approach, the words it uses, the object it touches, the way the child is told to remain still and not speak, matches the documented steps of an Aelid ritual for the trapping of a human soul in a small vessel. The Aelids used such rituals. The vessels they used were small, often beautiful, often described as glowing. The soul-trapping process required the cooperation of the subject, which the ritual achieved through specific framing, making the subject believe they were receiving something rather than giving something. In the story, the child receives a wish. In the ritual, the subject gives a soul. The child in the story is happy at the end. The story does not follow them further than the moment the wish is granted. The story was in general circulation. It was read to children at bedtime. The adults who read it did not know what they were reading. It is possible the person who wrote it did not know either. It is possible this was a coincidence. The sequence is specific enough that coincidence is difficult to maintain as an explanation. The fairy in the story is small and bright and kind. It grants what you ask for. It disappears into the forest afterward. No record of what it carried with it. Before the Ages of Man exists in multiple versions. The standard text is written for an adult scholarly audience. The children's edition simplifies the language, shortens the timeline, and removes details considered too complex or too disturbing for young readers. Comparing the two versions reveals the shape of what was removed. The children's version removes most of the sections dealing with the Etada, who chose to become mortal. In the adult version, this choice is described in terms that are not comfortable. The Etada who became mortal gave up their immortality, their full power, and their ability to exist outside time. The text describes what this cost them in enough detail that a reader feels the weight of it. It is not a clean sacrifice. It is a diminishment made willingly, which makes it harder rather than easier to sit with. The children's version replaces this with something simpler. The spirits wanted to help. They gave some things up to do that. It was a kind thing to do. The adult text also includes a passage about the Etada who chose not to become mortal, what happened to them, where they went or did not go. This passage is entirely absent from the children's version. What was decided was that children should know the gods made a sacrifice, but should not know what the sacrifice actually felt like. They should know the outcome, but not the process. Someone decided this. The editing was deliberate. The removed sections were not simplified, they were absent. What children were not supposed to feel, reading about the creation of the world, was the weight of permanent loss made by choice. They were supposed to feel gratitude. The adult version does not make gratitude easy. The children's version makes it the only available response. The Red Kitchen Reader appeared in the chapter on Redguard memory, where the focus was on the battle described in its introduction. Here the focus is something different. The ingredient measurements in the recipes themselves. The recipes are real. The food is accurately Redguard in character. The measurements are given in standard units. Nothing in the recipes is unusual when read as recipes, but the measurements in the first 7 recipes read not as quantities, but as distances, with a specific conversion that the introduction's battle description provides implicitly describe a route, a series of legs, directions not given as north and south, but as quantities that translate to distances when you know the key. The route ends at a location that, when the distances are followed from a known starting point near the coast of Hammerfell, corresponds to a place marked on older maps as a site of significant historical events, not a famous location, not a place that appears in any current guide, a place that appears in old records and then stops appearing. The cookbook was sold at markets. It was used for cooking. The recipes work. The food is good. The measurements are accurate for their culinary purpose. They are also something else. For a reader who knew what to look for, they were directions. Most readers made the food. Some of them, presumably, followed the route. ABCs of Alchemy is an educational text for young students. It introduces the alchemy system through simple examples. Each letter corresponds to an ingredient. Brief descriptions of properties. Safe, introductory, appropriate for beginners. The first 6 entries are exactly what they should be. Common ingredients, basic properties. Nothing that would concern a teacher or a parent. The 7th entry is different. The ingredient listed for the 7th position has properties that the text describes in educational terms. Mild, useful, appropriate for a beginner to work with, and individually, this is accurate. The ingredient is mild, but the text also happens to place this ingredient in a list where it follows items 3 and 4. Items 3 and 4, combined with item 7, produce something the alchemy system does not name directly. The combination is not listed in any standard alchemy reference. It is not a standard potion. The effect, documented in medical texts that are not educational materials, is significant and not appropriate for anyone described as a young student. The combination only becomes apparent if you read the list as a sequence rather than as individual entries. If you try items 3, 4, and 7 together, as a student experimenting with the ingredients they have been given in the order they appear, the text does not suggest combining them. It presents them as separate, independent examples. The combination is available to anyone who reads the list as a list rather than as a collection of individual facts. Some students would have noticed, the ones who read carefully, the ones who paid attention to the sequence rather than just the content. Night of Tears is the historical account of the destruction of Sarthal, the ancient Atmoran settlement, attacked by snow elves, in what became one of the defining events of early Skyrim history. The full text is complex. It acknowledges that the snow elves were not simply attacking without reason. Something in Sarthal was connected to what they wanted, the Eye of Magnus, a powerful, magical artifact that the Atmorans had discovered and kept. The children's summary of this event removes the motivation entirely. In the children's version, the snow elves attack because they are afraid of the Atmorans, because the humans are building and expanding, and the elves feel threatened by their presence. This is not inaccurate as a general characterization of the era, but it omits the specific reason, the artifact, the thing that was found, the thing that made Sarthal specifically a target rather than just another settlement. Why this was removed from the children's version is not stated in either text, but the effect of the removal is significant. A child who learns this history from the summary grows up believing that Sarthal was attacked because of what humans were. The full text says, Sarthal was attacked because of what humans had found. Those are different lessons. One is about identity. One is about discovery and its consequences. What you find changes what happens to you. Who you are does not always. The children's version teaches the safer lesson, the one that does not make children think too carefully about what is buried under the places where they live. The books that looked like children's stories were doing several things at once: entertaining, teaching something simple, and, underneath, doing something else: preserving, encoding, hiding in plain sight inside forms that no one examined carefully because they already knew what they were. Knowledge that survived in children's books survived because nobody burned children's books. Nobody locked them in restricted collections. Nobody required credentials to read them. They sat on open shelves and on market tables and in the hands of adults who read them aloud without listening closely to what they were saying. Some things survive by becoming something small, something that looks too simple to contain what it actually contains. The Dwemer hid their most important work in ruins. The Aelids encoded things in ritual. The people who wrote these books hid things in the places children sleep. The pages were small. What they held was not. And beneath all of this, beneath the stories and the codes and the hidden sequences, is a larger question. Not what magic does, what magic is, why it works at all. Why telling the world something false, with enough conviction, begins to make it true. Some books in Skyrim ask that question directly.